Thank you everyone for attending today. It's day 3 of our 2021 annual V3 implementation meeting. We are really appreciative that you're here and participating in these great presentations and conversation. These sessions are being recorded and will be shared on the NEMSIS website for future reference. We'll send a message out on the Google group next week when those have all been processed and posted on the website. Please update your name in the participation list with your affiliation, whether that's a software product, a vendor, a state, a national organization. It just really helps other participants to be able to see who's in the meeting, who's having the conversation, helps us to get to know each other a little bit better in this virtual environment. We capture all the feedback on the topics that are presented. So we review your comments, we pull all the chat so that anything that we're not able to address in the meeting, we take all of that great feedback and we really spend the next several months making sure that we go through and address these issues on future V3 calls and really dig into solutioning for questions. MS Teams is our backup platform. So if for any reason we get kicked off of Zoom, look for an email in the email address that you use to register, and we'll send you the link to Teams. Please continue to be respectful to the presenters and other participants. We've had really terrific conversation, and we sincerely appreciate that. Please continue to ask questions, provide comments, give your input. We understand that this is a really large group, which is exciting, but it also means that it can be hard to jump in on a topic before the topic changes or before somebody else has brought up their question and we start going down that path. Please feel free to email us with your suggestions, comments, feedback. We're also happy to set up time for a more in-depth conversation. So if we hit a nerve with a topic that you have some insider perspective that could really help benefit the issue, please reach out to us. We'll set up some time and just have a much smaller visit and be able to have those in-depth conversations. So now that you have been housekeeped to death, we're all ready to go. It's our final day. We're totally excited. We're thrilled to have such a huge participation this year. Thank you for being with us. And I'm going to turn it over to Monet Ihanacho. She is going to start us off with a good discussion today about V3 state and vendor status and some early adopters, resources. She's going to start that conversation for us this morning. Monet, it is all you.
Thank you. Let's see if I can share my screen. You see my screen, Chris?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, fantastic. Let me see. Oh, I apologize. I'm having a little technical issue here. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again so much for being here this day. I want to briefly talk to you about the role that I play at the NEMSIS TAC as the business analyst, state support specialist. So the work that I do is primarily with the state EMS managers. Today, I'm going to talk about the state and vendor status, the published transition plans that we have online, as well as the plans that we have determined for early adopters or who have identified themselves as early adopters, and then the 3-5 resources that we currently have available on the NEMSIS website. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show you the location where you're going to find these resources on the NEMSIS website, and I've added that link location in the chat. So from the homepage of the NEMSIS website, you'll go to using EMS data and then scroll down to version 3.5 revision. And it's the first tab here on the page, this red button that says state and vendor transition plans. Now, when you open the document, you'll see the first tab has the state transition plans, and Dr. Mann showed this information yesterday. And you can see that we have several states identified, and then others have indicated to be determined. And once that information changes, we will update this information on this particular spreadsheet. The other location where you'll find that transition information is from the homepage of the NEMSIS website. You scroll down to the state map and you can click on any state. I've chosen Alabama as an example this morning. And so if you choose a state, you have to scroll down midway on the page until you see the state V3 implementation timeline. You'll notice here that we have number 1 identified as the go live date. Number 2 is the planned timeframe for EMS agencies to move to version 3.5. Sometimes it's the same quarter, and other times it may be slightly different. And the third tab, or the third number, says the planned closure date for receiving version 3.4 data. Now, there's been some discussion about a potential extension for that, and we did not include this question in our survey that was conducted in March. So if states volunteer this information, we can update it on the NEMSIS website, and at a later date, we'll reach out and find out when the closure may take place. But version 3.4 will be open for some time. When you look at the second tab on that spreadsheet, you'll see that we have the planned software vendor availability, when your products will be ready and available for the states. And you can see several states have indicated several vendor companies have indicated their information here. Some have also indicated to be determined. Now, there are certainly more software companies, that participate with NEMSIS. And so as you provide or, establish your plans, you can certainly send us that information and we will add it to the spreadsheet. The other location that you can find out about compliance software is from the NEMSIS homepage. Just click on technical resources, or any page of the NEMSIS website, technical resources, and then choose compliance software testing status. And there is a box here that says view compliance software for NEMSIS version. There are several versions that you can check, but if you want to know specifically about 3.5, just choose 3.5 in that smaller option box, and the information will be provided. So I know this looks like a disco ball, and when we met in person, we used to have a little party, but I'm actually using this ball today as a sort of a crystal ball. Well, we really don't need a crystal ball to determine who the early adopters are, because states have indicated who may come on first, or at least their plans to do so. So you will see here that we have several states that have identified that in between quarters 3 and 4 of this year, they would actually like to transition to the 3.5 standard. And certainly, things change. And so if this information changes, we will certainly update the information as it changes. And so just reach out to us with that new information. Now, you can see here, I have this very sad looking gray map of the version 3.5 map on the NEMSIS website. And I am really actually very excited to see that this map will start to change colors, because I know that there's a lot of activity that will take place, and resources that will, people are starting to work on resources. And so we can populate this page with information about the resources that you're currently working on. Now, my team said I should try to breathe between my presentation slides. So I'm gonna take a break here and take a little breather and talk about resources. But first I wanna do a poll. So Chris, if you don't mind, can you queue up that poll for me? So I wanna know how many NEMSIS resources have you currently viewed related to the 3.5 standard? We need some cool music, like the Jeopardy music in the background. Okay. Are we almost there? $64 responses. Okay. All right, Chris, I think that gives me a good idea. Wow. All right, so let's look at that. Can we share the results? Well, it looks like a few people have indicated they have not received or looked at any of the resources. Some indicate that they've looked at 18, and then the majority have looked at between 3 and 5, so that's pretty awesome. Oh, did you guys see the results? All right, so.
What are those 18, by the way?
I'm sorry?
What 18 are those?
I'm getting right to it, my friend.
Okay.
All right. So on the technical resources page, there is a tab that says data dictionaries and XSDs. Did I miss a slide? Okay. Well, the first resource that I want to let you know about is the data dictionary. And I'm sure that you're not surprised to hear me say that this should become your recommended evening reading. Certainly, if you read this document and just try to become familiar with it, you will certainly put yourself in a great position to move and transition to the 3.5 standard. And then here's a high level overview of the elements. There's an EMS section, a DIM section, and a new state data set section. And so I encourage you to take a look at this document as your starting place. Now, I think that was my good friend David who asked, where are those 18 resources? Well, on that same page, you'll see that we have on the data dictionary section, there are 5 documents. And then in the data set schema section, there's an additional 4. And then the additional documents are listed here below. And that's 9 for a total of 18 resources. So take a peek at any one, just choose a few and review the information. And I think that will help put us all in a better position as we start to transition. Now, a few weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, we had a boot camp, and I described a product that I constructed called a crosswalk document. Now, on the NEMSIS website, that is officially titled the version 3 summary of changes. And so I apologize if this will be a little repetitive for some of the state managers, but I'm gonna just briefly talk about that document. So basically, I used one of the CSV documents of the elements and converted it to an Excel document, added tabs that describe all of the elements, the state specific elements, the national elements only, and then the new version 3 elements, the state data set elements, and then the last tab describes the changes between 3.4 and 3.5. And then you should pay particular attention to the columns that are voted in red, because those columns have some of the specific work that you did when you had the work group meetings from 2017 to 2019. So these are summaries of that great work that you did and the impact to the provider. So briefly talking about that document, I mean, 135 changes, that sounds like a lot. So where do we start? What is the approach to tackle the version 3.5 standard? Well, I would like to suggest that we think about the 26 added V3.5 elements. This does not include the state data set section. So of the 26 new elements that were added to the V3.5, 12 of those were labeled as national or state. Only 1 additional element was a state element, and then 13 were optional or recommended usage. So if you have been submitting version 3.4 for the last few years, I would suggest that you are further ahead than you realize. If we look at the 12 national elements, perhaps focusing on just the 5 e-disposition elements is a more manageable approach. We see that e-situation 20 and then the e-arrest elements, they basically have values added, which improve the provider experience. And then the last 3 e-outcome elements, that those were changed to be more conducive with hospitals and HIEs. Therefore, I've kind of bolded in red here this section that we could probably use as a starting place for dealing with what changed compared from 3.4 to 3.5. Now, let's talk a little bit about adding value. And I just want to say that here at the TAC, we're constantly thinking of ways to add value and make your jobs easier. So one of the things that we propose that will make life easier is the state data set. And every element in the state data set section is now a national element. Now, if you've been populating the state data set for over the last 1 to 2 years, again, you're already ahead of the game. I personally believe that if you have really saved months of time just by gathering the information in the information gathering stage. And I want to take a few seconds just to remind folks where you find this tool in case you're not familiar. So on the NEMSIS website, you would go to View Reports. It's this last tab here that says State Dataset Builder, and it's the first button here that says State Dataset Builder. So I use my the state of Arkansas and my friend there as an example here. You would select your state, and what you will see here are the various sections, the custom data elements through the facilities. Now, while 51 states and territories have already started building the state data set by at least adding their agencies, there are these additional sections that should be completed. And it's not too late to start the work. We are here to help you. And so I encourage you to reach out. Again, if we look at those resources on the NEMSIS website, we can see 51 states have started a state data set. But again, you can see here that let's say 17 states have added their protocols permitted by state. 20 have identified the procedures or the medications. And so these are some of the sections that we would like to continue to work on. One other thing I wanted to say is that I would typically reach out to the states once a month and ask if I could help you populate this information. But due to the pandemic and your heavy workloads, I have relaxed my contacts and reduced my frequency of contacts, but I am still available. Our team is available to help you with populating these resources. Now, one of the important changes to mention in the state data set is this effective date, which is now added to the schema. It's located under version 3 state API. This was important because many state managers would send files, the XML files, and say, I want it to become effective on this date. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the added recommended elements that are part of the state data set. And you'll see here that we have S Agency 01, S Agency 02 and 3. Now you're very familiar with these elements because we've talked a lot about this as I have worked with you to identify your D Agency 01 and D Agency 02. And then the facility information, again, if you've been populating the state data set, you have actually been entering this information for some time. And then we'll talk about the state data set mandatory elements. You'll see that there are 10 here. And we've had a lot of discussion for this meeting about custom elements. If your state has a custom element, your support team will need to familiarize themselves with this section of the elements. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the renamed and retired elements. And so you'll see here that deconfiguration 02 through 5, they were retired from the DIM dataset section and moved to the state dataset section. And then there were some changes for e-exam 08. All right, time for a breather. I'm going to ask, are there any questions that I can answer? Any urgent questions that anyone have at this time? Feel free to come off mute. Okay, if you have a question, add it to the chat and we'll take a look at it and I'll move forward. So the
Hey,
change.
Monet, there's a
Yes,
question
ma'am.
in chat from Jen Korea.
Okay, Jen, I have seen a few states who have put facility codes into their schematron that have a data set list or facility that does not match the schematron for third-party vendors. This can be an issue. Yes, ma'am, I totally hear you and I agree that if you use the state data set for your facility changes, you will not have to update, hard code your state schematron files. And so Josh Legler will actually talk a little bit more about this later on this morning. Thank you, Jen, for the question. Okay, so here we're talking a little bit about those changes with deconfiguration. So you'll see that deconfiguration 02 through 5 changed, and they're now S configuration 2 through 6. Now we still have an element that will be labeled as S configuration 04. It's just not identified here, but that element name will be EMS certification levels permitted to administer each medication. And here are some other changes. So D agency changes for D agency 15 through 21, change from national to state level elements. Now you can actually take a break, take a breather, get comfortable, remove your shoes, because we're going to talk about some things that were actually removed. So here's a list of the elements that were removed in case you are, unfamiliar or there's a little confusion. Just look at the spreadsheet, filter on each column, and you'll see the specifics about what elements were removed. And now we're going to just take a little breather. Are there any questions? Okay, well, I'll talk now a little bit about the fixes. And there were only 2 technical fixes, and they had to do with increasing the length of the characters from 50 to 255, and a constraint pattern change for e-vitals. And so this is something the vendors will manage, these changes. Now, I know that that looks like a lot of information, a lot of changes, and you're probably really concerned. It's overwhelming, and you're sitting back saying, what have you done for me lately? Well, I am available. Our team is available. All you have to do is reach out. You're not in this alone. And I really encourage you to just send us an email and say, hey, I need 30 minutes for you to show me how to do something, or I would like some assistance with anything. I literally wake up every morning, well, Monday through Friday, and I try to figure out how I can be a better assistance to the state managers. I know that you're overwhelmed. I know that you may have only 1 or 2 people in your office. And so if there's anything that we can do to alleviate the stress of updating your resources and getting you further along, we're here to help you. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you for all that you do. And the last slide is my contact information. I know the majority of you on the call, but if you're new and I haven't met you yet, just reach out and we'll be available to provide assistance for you. Okay, are there any additional questions?
Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple, Monet. So Adam has questions about other facility codes and maybe some standardization. I don't know, Adam, if you want to add anything to that.
Adam, come
Hi,
off mute, my friend. How are you
Sure.
today?
hi, great. Yeah, it kind of goes along with Jennifer's idea. So sometimes there's an e-disposition in order to make sure e-disposition was a 20 code is filled out, or what am I talking about? E-disposition 02. It's filled out. You know, they created generic codes for things like, you know, hey, PA hospital or clinic or air medical landing zone. They created codes for that. So we export. And there already is a field for some of that type of information, you know, there, E20, Division 21. So it'd be great if we can kind of try to unify some solid, if we want to continue that kind of pattern is providing some generic code in that section, that there's a standard kind of list of these types of things, to make it easier rather than, you know, customizing a bunch of if statements or whatnot around you know, which state it is.
Okay, I'm gonna ask my team for some assistance addressing Adam's question. We have so many experts on the call this morning. This is perfect.
Yeah, this doesn't have to be a solution now, but
Okay.
if someone can recognize that or see that occur, like an A, you know, that'd be good. But
Okay, thank you, Adam. We appreciate your feedback. Let's see, I saw another question. How do we report a bug with a schematron? Simply send that information to the NEMSIS PEDS web address. It's listed on the front page of the NEMSIS website, or you can reach out to any member of the TAC with that information. Scott, we will definitely like to look at that. And Julianne has added that information to the chat. And then someone else said, oh, okay, Anne had a question about what are EPC vendors planning to do about deprecated e-outcome fields that are currently used in linkages and integrations.
Yeah, this is Clay. I'll speak a little bit to that, but would love to hear directly from the vendors. Anne brings up a good point. The elements that were removed were mostly removed because most of the ones that were removed were related to the fact that their complexity to collect. So we had in there, I think it was time on a ventilator and some other elements that were not just automatically found in a EHR, not part of meaningful use elements, and there was real variability in how they would be calculated. So I'm not sure how well those were populated in the past, but it's a really good question. Adam, what are you thinking here? Let's see.
yeah, I was saying they're probably still going to remain if some people are collecting them. I mean, unless they cause a conflict somehow.
Yeah.
It just won't be exported, obviously, via 3.5.
This is Anne, and I don't want to put everybody on the spot, but something that I'm always thinking of with all of the changes is this the kind of thing, we haven't had this happen before where we've had integrations like HIE integrations. A lot of states have something like that with at least one or more registries, or they send to another one. I'm trying to wrap my head about the cost. I don't know if EPCR vendors, I would think they'd find a way to keep these. You can't just shut down an integration usually the program needs, but I don't know if there's going to be a cost that's going to be charged, if that's the plan, if kind of the idea is, you know, and this gets complicated because it involves vendors of other types of registries too. But I'm just trying to kind of understand if this is a big thing, a big ask, or if it's something that everyone kind of plans to do and isn't really going to be a surprise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so specifically about the e-outcome section.
For us, yeah, I'm sure there's other states that might have something else they're worried about. I mean, there's a few changes like to gender in 3.5 that when you have your deterministic linkage or whatever based on matching of gender, the changes just aren't going to match up exactly with like what NTDB has.
Yeah, got
As
it.
I know, it just little things like that. So that's an example of an element that's changing. It's not deprecating, it's a little different, but for us, it's the outcome fields because we're getting stuff back from our trauma registry and then in a different ones back from our HIE. Yeah. And also if states on the call have those kind of integrations, that's something, I know Chip talked about that too, something to think about when you start looking at your B35 plans, make sure both of your vendors or all of your vendors involved understand that there's going to be a timeline they need to, maybe, I'm getting way over my head. This is something Josh would probably be wondering what I'm talking about, but something, but you know, the XSD or something has to be changed because if our vendor changes to a custom element or if ESO does, I'm pretty sure that has to be recoded too. So there's gonna be a little work and I'm just kind of trying to get a feel for where everybody is on this or if everybody's got this in their plans.
Yeah, and it's Josh, I think you're right on track with that. These probably aren't huge lifts, but they definitely have to be addressed. Your integration will break if you don't do something.
I would like to, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Josh, and perhaps while some of the vendors are thinking about that, Josh, do you want to talk a little bit about the schematron kind of issue? The business logic could be a big lift, right, with e-disposition 12. We are planning to provide some resources that will help with that, right, Josh? Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, when we met with the state data managers last month for the boot camp, one of the topics that we reviewed with them was the fact that as they move to 3.5, they're going to have to put out validation rules in schematron format that are targeted to 3.5. Just like there's an XSD for 3.5 and there's national schematron rules for 3.5. And just the fact that, you know, so many validation rules touch on e-disposition.12. Probably a third of all validation rules in existence today use that element as part of their criteria. And so it means evaluating every one of those existing schematron rules that a state has and asking the question, would this rule still work in 3.5 as coded, or do we need to update it for 3.5? So there will be definitely be an effort there.
Yeah, there's one more kind of important topic that's has a good thread on the chat as well, and I think it's related to folks who are putting facility list in their schematron files. Are lots of vendors seeing issues with that where like I think Adam or someone mentions that an agency may have a different name for a facility, and then they end up with a schematron warning or failure.
So Clay, this is Keith. I think one of the biggest things we're having a challenge inside our med software and other places is because we transport to so many different states. When a state names a facility that's not in their state a different name than the state where that facility is actually based. So let's say it was Texas General inside of Texas, but I'm just picking states. But if Oklahoma named it General Texas, we're noticing a lot of variances on what a facility is actually named in different data sets and addresses. And just obviously the codes are used specific to that state, but still the names are different. So now if we're sending to Texas, we have to remember to send Texas General. But if it's was going to Oklahoma and transporting that hospital, we have to remember to send General Texas. So we're noticing a lot of variance just among the states using different names for facilities because they're trying to code other people's facilities that aren't in their state.
Oh, great. And that gets caught, right? That gets caught, Keith, because there was a schematron rule, right?
Correct. And that hits hard on this, where we get caught it won't go through because, oh, wait, I forgot. Oklahoma named that different. And so if they wrote it in schematron, they wrote it the way they want it with periods, spaces, whatever, it has to match exact versus what the facility is really called. Correct.
Yeah. Really good point. Really good point. And perhaps we can work with the states a little bit to better understand that that complexity that can surface.
And Clay, this is Samantha with you. So just, and I have a question because this is a frustrating issue, but why don't we use MPI codes for the facility codes? I mean, that would be a national level code that we could see going across all states would always identify the facility.
Yeah, it's a great question, Samantha. And we've looked into that several times. I think I'm trying to remember. I think the big issue was that a facility can have several NPIs.
Right.
And that, of course, again, becomes problematic kind of along the lines of what Keith was talking about a little bit. Yeah.
At least
so
there's one spot to go look for it though.
Yeah, that's true.
Then I think sometimes the confusion comes because when they add it to the data set, they might get it directly into their direct entry systems. And so it's not really as big an issue for that. It's the third-party vendors. And that usually comes when they add facilities, like I said, into their data set, but they're not adding it into their schematron, where the schematron rule isn't just, it must be an existing code, but it must be this specific code, sometimes with this specific name. And that's not in their schematron, right? So we have the list, we've updated it for the code, but it won't clear the schematron because that code doesn't exist in their system for third-party submitters.
Okay, good point.
I don't know if this is always the best solution, but what we've done in Arizona, this is Ann, is we do have some generic codes that are meant to be used for the acute cares, are meant to be used as a temporary fix. So in between the time that I get the licensing number from licensing, which is usually like the day the hospital opens, until we get a new schematron out, they can be sent to that other generic code so that it can make it into the system until our schematron includes that new one. Obviously, direct use entries get it right away as soon as I add it. It's not perfect because then, of course, the hospital can't see that record until we update our schematron because the correct code isn't being sent over. And then I just run a report every week to check for agencies sending in that generic code for acute care facilities that kind of abuse of the code, you know, where they are in there, they're in the schematron, and then I send them back to the agencies to fix and update. And it's worked pretty well. I mean, it's not perfect, but I get stuff in. I don't do a schematron every 2 weeks, and I still get my hospitals their records. Just an idea.
Yeah, it's a good thought, and maybe it goes back to what Samantha said. I'm kind of watching the chat, and it looks like a lot of states have a set of codes that they, I guess they're MPI codes, perhaps, that they're using, and perhaps are clearly hospitals can have several MPIs, but if the states have settled on a list, I think it was back to Samantha's comment that at least has one source that is less likely to be erroneous due to spelling or blanks or periods.
And Clay, the one thing I wanted to add to that point is I think some of the biggest challenges is with third-party vendors is the states traditionally get the facilities correct inside of their state. They match them up perfect. They get them from their licensing side. You know, those lists seem to be dead on correct with codes and names and not many issues. The issues mostly becomes, to Ann's point, when it's a facility outside that state. So they're coding another state's facility in whether they use generic codes to say, this is the generic Oklahoma code, or if they try to specifically say what that facility is. I think the challenge becomes when they go outside of their state boundaries, you know, we get conflicting codes with the same name of a hospital. So in some states, that one hospital, depending on all the states around it, can actually have 6 codes and different standards. Some use MPI, some might come up with it, but the same hospital in NEMSIS world will have 6 different codes that need to be sent depending on who we're speaking to.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Yep. Yeah, point well taken. We can take this back and perhaps go out to the DMC with some recommendations, see if we can come up with a better way to deal with cross-border codes. David, were you going to say something?
Yes. So another thing that kind of comes up as a difficulty is that we seldom, I don't think any that we work with, the state has the schematron enforced on the EMS dataset side, but not on the DEM side. And so it will get configured correctly, or it'll pass the configuration stage, and then we'll have errors down the line. And I think those errors could have been caught at the configuration state when they're entering the data for the DEM data set.
If there was
David, I'll pass the $1,000 to you later today. Thanks for setting the stage for my presentation.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
great.
this has certainly been great conversation. We're just a couple minutes over, so I don't want to shut this down too quickly. And Jeff, I did see your chat comment earlier. We are going to have some more time as well for kind of a broader Q&A, but Clay, Jeff Perkins was asking about criteria to determine elements getting added or retired. I don't know if we want to talk about that now or later in the day.
Okay, great. I'll keep track of that. Thank you.
Okay. So with that, we're going to kind of transition over to continuing to talk about V3.5 support materials, and Lori is going to talk about some tools that we are going to make available, or what we should make available for 3.5 support materials. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lori.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ben. And I really appreciate the conversation that was happening. And I hope we can continue that conversation and engagement and just switch topics for a few moments. So we are really hoping during this session that we can just facilitate some conversation, dialogue. We'd love to get more feedback regarding specifically, as Ben said, the creation of some support materials for version 3.5. And we've heard from you that training is hard, and we want to take some time to dig a little deeper into that today and figure out specifically, why is it hard? What is hard? How can we support you in that? So I encourage you to dream big, kind of the sky's the limit. In a perfect world scenario, what would the support look like? And then we can take that and determine our next steps from there. So we will have a few opportunities for some polls as well as discussion during this session. And I want to share first at a recent boot camp, which I know Monet mentioned, we solicited some feedback on this topic as well from state EMS managers. And we heard from them some of what they're looking for that I wanted to just share briefly. And primarily when we asked who do you most need resources for, their focus was on agencies, that they need help supporting agencies in this transition. And from the same state managers, we asked what modality, what type of training would be most useful, and they were interested in short little 2 to 4 minute videos or potentially informational sheets. They felt like that was more helpful than a longer training session or longer recorded videos, were little snippets on specific topics and specific subjects. So we appreciated that feedback, and this may be helpful for vendors here as well, for as you're designing your training or supporting your clients as well. It may be good to hear what they appreciate and what they're looking for. When we asked what topics were the most important, they really prioritized e-disposition 12 as something that they felt like they needed more support in. Defined list was another one. E-outcomes was lower on the list of topics that they may need more support. So basically, we want to share with you, we are currently in the early development stages, and we are actually now producing some multimedia tools to facilitate in this transition. In that, we're looking at 3 different audiences. We recognize clinicians have a unique need and focus on what they need for support. Agencies have another need, and then state managers may have another need. We would like to do a quick poll. Chris, if you could pull up my first one. And this question is just for states first. So just for state representatives that are here. If you are a state, would you appreciate it, or would it be helpful if NEMSIS could work with vendors to show how clinicians will document these changes in the field specifically? So we're wondering if that would be helpful to you. We've got a lot of responses already. So it looks like overwhelmingly 95, 96% of you are saying, yes, that would be very helpful. I think clinicians want to know which box to check. How did it look before? What's it going to look like now? And they want that real concrete example. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Chris, let's end that one and pull up the second one. The second question now is for vendors. Did we share those results? Did they see that? Or did just I see that? Here, I'll
Yeah,
share.
no, we see it. We see it. Yeah.
You do, okay.
Yeah.
So 97% said yes, that would be very helpful. And then the second question, this is for vendors now. Knowing that 97% of the states said that would be helpful, would you be willing to collaborate and share this information with us as we're creating training videos, or if you're creating videos for states as well? And it looks like we've got a lot of vendors here today. Let's see, 30, 27, 30 people. 98% saying yes, so that is great to hear. And we would love to, I'll put another plea out at the end of my talk today, but we'd love to partner with you in that and help make that connection between vendors and clinicians, if we can play a role in that. Our next question is, as we talked about those different stakeholders, let's talk for a minute just about clinicians first. And I'd love to hear from you, if you're a state or a vendor or even another stakeholder on the line today. What do you feel like is needed for clinicians? What kind of support can we give them? We talked about potentially sharing from vendors specifically what this will look like for them, for different types of questions, how it's changed. Other than that, are there topics that you feel like would be helpful? Maybe vendors, if you want to share what you have been creating or what you've been doing to help in this transition, that may be helpful for other people to hear as well. A little awkward silence.
Could you rephrase question?
Sure. Yeah, we're looking for what do you feel, what type of support do you feel is needed for clinicians? How can we support them in this change? Put yourself in their shoes. What do you think they need? I don't think that there's clinicians necessarily on the call today, although there may be some.
This is Samantha with you. So it's not apples to apples, but the documentation that you provided in collaboration with CMS on the ET3, like the scenario based, how to do it would be, I think, very helpful.
Perfect. Yeah, that's really great feedback.
Only thing I could think of is just maybe a readout of some of the values, the definitions of some of the fields. Maybe, I don't know if
Hmm.
there is a confusion on. I mean, for example, we just went through. We know NEMSIS did better on 3.5 as far as the word interfacility and split it out into what it actually meant. Just some of those related things on how they interpret what fields mean, or was a cardiac arrest done prior to or on this call, like what those scenarios really mean. That's the only thing I could think of.
Yeah, that's great, Adam. That's really good feedback. It's a great idea. I can see a video on that topic being really helpful.
Along with the confusion topic that just got mentioned, you have hundreds of fields per record, and especially new people in the field are going to be completely bowled over and overwhelmed by this. So I think any new training has to be aimed at breaking this down so that it's not an overwhelming wall of data. How am I going to get through 15 calls at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to do all this? So samples of how you can get through it quickly, ways to break it down, way to make it look like a tameable beast. Work in some of those things that was just mentioned about in those samples about clearing up confusion issues, maybe a sample on interfacility transport so that they understand what those fields mean and how it's not as big a monster as it looks when you first see it.
Thanks, Jeff. That's really great feedback as well. We're taking notes on all this today, so thank you. Anything else you can think of from a clinician's perspective of what they may be thinking or feeling that we can keep in mind as we create this, what they may need?
It's Frank. I think if you put the fields in a logical order and then you sort of use business rules, business logic to guide the medics through. I've been a medic a long time. They're troubleshooters by nature. We are. They'll get through it. I do think the NEMSIS extended data definitions were really helpful in 3.3.4 and 3.4.0. But published as well for helping people understand which value to choose in each agency situation. So that's something you might reference.
Thanks, Frank. That's helpful. It's good to hear. Anything else specifically clinician focused? Okay, let me know if you think of something, but we will move on to agencies next. Thinking kind of that same question, but now thinking of agencies, what kind of materials do you feel like they may need? What topics, what can we keep in mind as we create these resources? What questions are you hearing from them? What are they overwhelmed by? What should we be aware of?
Lori, recently when NEMSIS and NHTSA came and presented at our conference, we saw overwhelming question from agencies of the value of NEMSIS, the value of reporting. And I think that there's something to be distributed there and explained, as well as the value behind the changes, right? I think that first bullet point is a true example of that. Why do I really need to report 4 different fields when I've been accurately reporting one for 30 years or so?
That's good. Yeah, a little of the history behind the changes and why and how it's used maybe as well, how our data is used and why it's necessary. Thanks.
Right. I think there's a really great story behind the e-disposition changes, but that needs to be communicated out to people who actually use the system.
Yep. That's really great, Keenan. Thanks.
Especially since you're dealing with a group who hates change.
Yeah, I know. Change is hard for all of us. What else from an agency perspective?
Maybe there you can aim at more like if we have not information on where common problems are, common reporting, because they're the ones that are going to have to approve and upload.
Mhm.
So if we can identify areas that are common issues with approving an upload or confusion, those would probably be the areas they're more concerned about.
Yep, that's perfect. What else from an agency's perspective? All right, how about for state managers? So we mentioned recently there was a boot camp where we feel like a lot of resources were shared, but in addition to that, what do you feel like you still need? What questions do you still have that you feel like were not answered? What topics? As Monet mentioned, one-on-one sessions, we're happy to do that, to just say, hey, can we schedule a half hour, an hour and walk you through this? Or what would be the most helpful, or what do you feel like you still need now, state managers who are with us today?
Okay, this is Anne. I feel like I don't want to take all the conversation, so I was going to wait. So I think a one-on-one might be nice. There's still a few pieces that I know you guys have done educational talks on, and I still don't quite get it. So I don't know if anyone else is confused. And so it might be nice to do one-on-one so I don't waste everyone's time, that I still don't quite understand like those state specific S elements, like how that plays into when I'm trying to think about migration, like what am I doing with those and how is that going to work? And I know we've gone over it, I just still haven't quite gotten it yet. So that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think a one-on-one would be nice for questions.
Okay, great. One-on-one. And kind of the basics, going back to the basics or specific questions you have. That's perfect.
Yeah, Jay, this is Clay. I was reading through the chat. I appreciated your comment here. Is that one-page poster brochure? Is that a poster that says basically, hey guys, version 3.5 is coming out. Here's some highlights of what that will look like, or are you looking for something with a little bit more substance, do you think?
Well, thanks, Clay, for reading that. And that's a great clarification on there. Surprisingly, that I just recently did a study and I put in there, and it really shocked us, the fact that when we really looked at it seriously, that many providers aren't even documenting what a 911 response is. And it's kind of like, wow, this one's really humble. I'd never anticipated this. So I was sitting there looking at some ideas, sending out some different documentation issues besides validity rules in the system for things. And I think especially like for the 3.5 stuff coming out, I mean, gosh, your guy down there did a great job presenting the other day about how do I document this type of call? I'm a non-transporting agent, I'm a transporting agent, and this type of stuff, and just a couple examples. And it would be nice if we had the ability to put some sort of customization in that added, like it looked like it came from national, federal, and state. So we could put some things together to add that more personal touch, instead of, yeah, this is just a national document putting in. Not that those are bad, but I'm trying to find some way where we can grasp these people just so they'll see that. And I don't know about anybody else. I'm just looking at, when we rolled our system out, we were one-on-one, we went to multiple agencies, we went to multiple times, and it seemed to work really well. We had good questions and feedback coming back. Today's world, we just don't have that capability to go there and get that feedback from the people. And a lot of agencies aren't willing to bring a lot of their folks in at the same time. So I'm trying to find an alternative that we can get some information out there and get it to all the shifts that are functioning at times. I hope that clarifies it a little bit, but thank you for asking.
Yeah, Jay, that's great. I think the work that Lori is going to undertake, that she's getting these great comments for. And by the way, thank you for everyone who's commenting. There's great ideas that are coming across the chat. This work will be multimedia, right? So there'll be short videos to watch. There'll be lots of things I think that could be distributed kind of as you're talking about, Jay. So that's actually very helpful to hear that. So that's really helpful. Wow, it sounds like the one-on-one, wow, folks would, lots of folks would love to do that. And we could work after doing a couple of those, kind of have a standardized approach there to ensure that we're hitting on the big issues, right? I think understanding how best to re-implement e-disposition into logic is going to be a big issue, and we can try to standardize those things that are occurring from state to state as we do a one-on-one. Yeah, this is great information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the idea Jay shared of it being customizable, that it can be information from federal and from state as well.
Yeah, it looks like Peter is volunteering to spend 11 years going to 15-minute meetings with 400,000.
I assume that the TAC would have that capability. I heard that there's some extra people coming on in December.
No problem. No problem.
That should shave it down to about 7 or 8 years. I think we'll be all right.
We don't sleep much here in Utah. All right. Any other ideas for state support, state managers? All right, moving on to this idea of a version 3.5 data dictionary template, similar to what Jay was sharing. Would it be helpful if we developed kind of a generic data dictionary template that could bring value to states and vendors? And I think, Chris, I've got a poll question for this one as well, if you want to pop that up and see how many people think that would be helpful, or would you rather make your own? We would like it to be able to be kind of customizable by you, branded by you, and individualized for each state. But if we gave you a template.
This may be another two-part one where the vendors want it. Will the states be willing to do it if you make it?
Yeah. All right, it looks like a lot of people are responding again. And a lot of people are saying, yes, that would be very helpful. So that's something we can work on.
Hey, Larry, could we ask one follow-up question here? Yeah, thank you very much for this. This is incredibly helpful. There have been a number of states that have asked us to provide the template, right? And we've been happy to do that. I just wanted to ask states if there is some attribute of the current data dictionary that they most often modify, or something that they don't find in ours that they traditionally add. Are any comments about what you might want to see on top of the current template that we're using?
That's a great question, Clay.
Yeah, this is Sharon in Nebraska. And the template, it would be nice if it could be able to be customized easily. So like when we have specific state validity rules to add to the template, that was rather difficult when I tried to do that for 3.4 because the pages would shift. So, and it would kind of mess up the entire document. So it would be nice if something was provided where we can easily edit it.
So no page numbers in it yet. It's an easy.
Well, page numbers were part of it. Yeah, what was provided was like hard coded some way to, so that if you added too much, then everything would like shift on the next pages.
Yeah, and maybe, yes, sorry.
It's okay. I just was saying thanks to Sharon.
Oh, yeah, sorry. And I apologize. I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but there is one more question to state. So the data dictionary that we provide is of course very technical, right? It has lots of data attributes, right? Is something recursive? Is it nillable? Things like that. And I think at the state level, that information is incredibly helpful, right? As you're trying to, share with an epidemiologist what this data looks like. Is this a one-to-many? Is this a one-to-one? Those kind of things can be helpful. But then the other side of the coin, right, is developing a data dictionary that could be used by providers, right? That has flushed out, if we put all the NEMSIS definitions into a document, into the dictionary, right? So it's kind of a hands-on dictionary used by providers. I don't know if that is even a thing for states if they try to do that. Any preference on those two approaches? Okay. I see some good comments. Thank you. This is helpful. Okay.
All right, sounds good. So as we're wrapping up today, I just want to reiterate that we'd love to work with some vendors. If you have collaboration ideas, links to training, we're seeing some really great examples come out in your conferences of trainings you have created on 3.5 transitions already. If we could pull links of that and use it in our training as well, or specific video or screenshot examples of your field product of what this looks like for clinicians. We'd love some examples of that we could collaborate with you on. So on the next slide here, I'll share my email. And if any of you are interested in being part of that, we also are putting together an educational committee. If there's anyone that would really love to help continue to give feedback. I know a few of you have already expressed interest in that. We appreciate that. We'd love to continue the conversation and see what we can do to help with this transition. So thanks so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. Any other questions on support materials or educational resources before we change topics? Okay, that's all I have. Back to you, Ben.
All right, thanks, Lori. We are actually scheduled now to take a quick 10-minute break. We're a couple minutes ahead of schedule, but we're going to keep the break at 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10:21 Mountain Time, 12:21 Eastern, and then we will give the prize wheel a very gentle spin.
Okay, great. I'm going to get my screen sharing up. And in the meantime, Chris, if you could pull up the poll, that would be great. Okay, quick poll, gut reaction. What's the most important data set in NEMSIS? Don't spend too much time thinking about it. All right, y'all were quick. Cool, yeah, no surprise here. The majority answered EMS data set, and I'm not going to try to dissuade you from that. Certainly the EMS data set is the data set that collects what EMS actually did for a patient on a 911 call or some other kind of EMS call. Pretty important. A few people did vote for state data set and DEM data set. I really just use this poll to give you a reminder that there are 3 data sets in the NEMSIS standard, not just one. But of those who voted for state data set and DEM data set, anyone who wants to unmute and chime in and say why they cast that particular vote? Rest in peace CAD data set. Okay, yeah. And med device data set.
Wow, Matt, you've been around way too long.
All right, well, yeah, I want to take the next half hour with you talking about agency demographic data, which I have called the underappreciated NEMSIS data set. And so want to put a little focus on agency demographic data. We spend a lot of time on the EMS data set, and rightfully so. That's where most of the time is spent in your software products. It's where EMTs are recording the calls they went on. And every little improvement that you make there for recording a call, a patient care report, every little improvement just multiplies by thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people saving a little bit of time here and there or getting their documentation a little more accurate. So it has a big effect. The agency demographic data, however, has been overlooked for many years. And so I want to just come and say today that demographic data matters too, and want to illustrate that in a couple ways. One is the importance of the information in the demographic data. For example, where do we find the answer to this question? What percentage of the US population is covered by paramedic ground EMS? Where do we find that answer? State data set, DEM data set, or EMS data set? And of course, it is the DEM data set. So we find that by looking in two places. One is the agency's service area, and the other is the level of service that the agency provides. And if we look in the service area and look at census tracts, then we can go look at the population of each census tract that the agency covers, and we'll get to a really close count of the total population that that agency serves. What if the agency has recorded this information for their service area? They serve in the state of Washington in the counties of Skagit and Snohomish, and they've left the census tracts and zip codes blank. Well, we could try to assume that they cover all of Skagit and Snohomish counties, which would be a very large population, but it may in fact be the case that they cover a small town that is on the border between the two counties, and they cover maybe just 10,000 people in one county and 10,000 in the other. We don't know that if we don't know what census tracts they serve. And of course, the NEMSIS TAC provides a tool for figuring out what census tracts an agency serves. We'd love to see vendors provide tools just integrated right into the system to allow their agencies to more easily record the census tracts and zip codes that they serve. Rather than looking through a list, can you allow them to click on a map, draw their service area, and as a product, software product, you figure out what area they serve. Where do we find the answer to this question? What percentage of EMS agencies are all volunteer? Of course, the answer again is DEM data set. It's in dagency.12 organization status. And so if that information is not correctly filled out, then we don't know if the agency is volunteer, paid, or a mix of the two. And where do we find the answer to this question? What percentage of EMS agencies allow their EMRs to administer naloxone? And of course, it is DEM data set. And we find that in the medication group for the agency. We get a list of medications for each of the license levels or certification levels that that agency employs. So there will be a list for the EMR level, and we can see the half dozen medications that that agency allows their EMRs to administer. What if an agency submits the same list of medications for all of the levels that they employ? They just take all 98 of the medications that are on their ambulance and they just turn that on for all different levels. Well, if that's the case, then we don't know really. I mean, we would then say, yep, EMRs are allowed to administer naloxone in that agency, but we might be wrong. Because I'm guessing that EMRs are not allowed to administer all of the medications that paramedics are allowed to administer in that agency. This is real life stuff right here. I can't tell you how many agencies' demographic data I have reviewed where I have seen that they have had the entire list of medications for all of their different levels. And so it happens a lot. I'm going to pause for a sec because I'm seeing lots of comments in the chat already. Does the NEMSIS standard allow custom DEM data elements? Yes, it does. Let's see, we use dispatch data to auto set the provider's service area zip codes and service area counties, but we let the provider designate their census tracts, which means nobody actually sets them. For those DEM fields, if you don't auto set them, they aren't going to get set, even if you provide slick UI to do so. Yeah, that's what we want to talk about a little bit today is how do you make this stuff a little more visible to an agency level administrator? Okay, so yeah, just the sheer size of the data sets means that we focus a lot on EMS data set. We have, 50 some state data sets across the country, but that is dwarfed by the 10,000 plus DEM data sets that we have across the country, which is in turn dwarfed majorly by the 40 million plus EMS data sets, patient care reports that come in on an annual basis. And yet, what I'd like to illustrate is how issues in the DEM data set actually bleed into all of those or some of those patient care reports. Let's take an example here. Let's say an agency has a DEM data set and they've listed 12 hospitals that they on their facility list. So these are 12 different hospitals that this agency may pick up patients at or transport patients to. And let's say they've done a good job setting up their state data set for 11 of those 12 hospitals. They're using the facility code and name and address location that the state has provided in the state data set. But they got it wrong for one of those 12 facilities, maybe just a typo in the facility code. Well, what happens when they start submitting some EMS calls to the state? They start submitting thousands of calls to the state. Well, every once in a while, they go to that one facility where they had the code wrong. And what happens is that code is wrong in the patient care report. And those patient care reports are kind of scattered throughout among the thousands of records that the agency has submitted to the state. And somewhere, 6 months into it or a year or two into it, the state catches on to a problem because a hospital called them up and said, hey, we can't find patient care reports from agency A. The state data manager looks into it and says, oh, that's because agency A is using the wrong facility code when they transport to your hospital. I'll get with them and get them to fix it. So the state data manager calls the agency fixes the facility code. Then the state data manager works with the agency to identify all those records that were bad and resubmit them to the state and try to clean up that PCR data. And it might be 6 months or 2 years worth of back data that needs to be fixed. So where's the best place to catch this problem? David Saylor answered it for me last hour, which is why I need to give him his $1,000. The best place to catch this issue is in the DEM data set. Let's look at a couple other examples. Let's say the state config, the state data set that the data manager has published, has Shriners Hospital and has facility code 872261. The agency sets up their software. They set up Shriners with a facility code of SHRH, and then they start going on calls. And every once in a while, they transport to Shriners. And when they do, their PCR has SHRH and Shriners as the code and the name. Think about this scenario. What are some of the issues if we wait until we're validating the PCR data to catch this problem? I'm not saying that we don't, that you shouldn't validate at the PCR level, but I am saying that you should validate at the demographic data level, and it's better if you catch it at the demographic data level. Why would that be? Just unmute or put some comments in the chat. Why is it too late to catch this issue in the PCR? Why is it better to catch it in the agency DEM data set?
Josh, this is Karen.
Yes.
So for me, working in South Dakota, we've had this issue, and there's, I mean, it's flat out the wrong code. And so by the time you realize it, as you mentioned before, you've had lots and lots of PCRs that have failed. To me, that's the big one. The second one is, I mean, it's related to the code, but also even if the code is correct and the name is wrong, depending on a state system reporting, now you're going to have quote unquote 2 names of hospitals that are displayed that also skews your data.
Yeah, so the fix requires resubmitting a bunch of PCRs. The dirtiness of the data makes it all the way into a bunch of PCRs. So if you don't fix it, then you've got that variety of data that you're just going to live with going down the road. Yeah, great. Peter said a change in one place, fix everywhere. Yeah, that's certainly a good reason. There's a couple other reasons I can think of. Any other thoughts on why it's better to catch this in DEM data set validation rather than PCR validation?
PCRs get propagated also.
Yeah, explain that a little more, David.
So the PCR goes other places. So it's, if you've shared with the wrong facility, not only did it not go to the right one, but it did go to the wrong one potentially. And anything that used that PCR downstream is also wrong. So now you're beyond the capacity of the agency to fix it.
Yeah, good thought. What other reasons would make it better to catch this in demographic data? All right, let me give you a couple others. Some states have implemented error level validation rules on facility codes. What that means is the state is actually rejecting the PCR, so it never even makes it into the state system at all. So from that perspective, if you can validate the demographic data up front and get the agency to fix it there, then you're less likely to reject PCRs down the road. And one other reason that I think is important, if the agency has set up the wrong facility code and a person is filling out a patient care report, the EMT is filling out the patient care report, and the EMT gets a validation error saying that their facility code is wrong. Is that an issue that the EMT can fix on that PCR? Or does an agency administrator need to fix that issue? That's one that has to go to an agency administrator to fix. So the PCR creator, the EMT, the one we're trying to support in making this an easy process for them to record what they did on their calls, they get presented with an error that they can't fix. And they've got to call their agency admin and say, hey, this is what I got, what's going on? And so it's better to have the agency admin fix it up front in demographic data, rather than to have an EMT bump into that issue while they're out in the field. Okay, just one more example. Let's say the state data set, the state recognizes the 2009 license levels, EMR through paramedic, but the agency has turned on the EMT basic and EMT paramedic levels, the old ones from the 90s. And then in the PCR, that means that all those crew members get those old levels assigned to them. In the medications and procedures, the level of the person who did the med or procedure, they all get the old codes assigned to them. It gets sprinkled throughout the PCR. It could be fixed in DEM data set by checking the license levels of the personnel in the DEM data set. So kind of to wrap that piece up, DEM data set is important for one, understanding the state of EMS in our country and in your state and within a particular locale. It provides important information about the resources of EMS in our country. And secondly, it's important for preventing bad PCR data. A lot of states are not receiving demographic data from agencies today. And one reason they say for not accepting it is because they have information about the agencies already in their licensing data system. And that's great that the state has that information about the agencies in the licensing system. But I think my argument here for this second piece, preventing bad PCR data, is that if you ask the agency using third-party software to submit data to your state about their agency, now you have an opportunity at the state level to evaluate whether their local level software was configured correctly, whether they are using the medication and procedure codes that the state would like them to use, whether they are using the facility codes, agency codes, and so on that the state would like them to use. Okay, so let's see, a couple other things in the chat. Anne said, I don't think many states accept imported DEM files from agencies, but maybe this info is outdated. This info is not outdated, Anne. What I would like to do is promote a change for the future here. And that is for states to begin accepting data from agencies. Ridgely said, we're afraid it will overwrite things we don't want messed with. Yeah, and that's one of the barriers that's been in place, is that the software products haven't really paid enough attention to demographics. They haven't provided features such as the ability for a state data manager to decide which pieces of information should come in to the state system. For example, maybe the state is not going to allow the agency to change its name by simply submitting demographic data. Maybe the agency needs to come through a licensing process for that. So today, the state doesn't have the ability to say, we want to accept demographic data, but don't process the name of the agency. We have set the name based on licensing records. We don't want it changed. So that's a potential area for improvement in the software. And Anne said, I think it was due to issues of getting duplicate data in some fields. And so that's something we're going to try to fix with NEMSIS 3.5. I'll touch on that in a second. California does require DEM data to be sent before turning on EMS data, which means that California has the opportunity to evaluate the quality of the configuration in the local software. And let's see. And yeah, thoughts on creating a California DEM schematron to help with the 3.5 shift. Thanks. I'm going to actually get to that in just a second. Okay, so what I'm proposing here is a shift to the future. Today, it seems like a lot of demographic data sets have been actually completed by the state data manager in the state system and then sent up to the national database just to fulfill the national database requirement. And I'm proposing a shift where now the agency completes that information and sends it to the state. That the state have a good way in their software product to manage what information gets processed versus what doesn't, and then the state can send up to national. Today, only a few states are receiving demographic data from agencies. Future, we want to see frequent submissions from the agency to the state. And today, we're seeing demographic data being sent once to the national database before an agency starts reporting. And in the future, we want to see frequent updates, not only to the state, but all the way to the national database for demographic data. Today, the data quality and demographics is really not checked. I've seen very rudimentary, if even existent at all, data validation in the software products for demographic data, whereas I see much more robust data validation for PCR data. So future demographic data quality actually gets checked and it gets improved over time. Let's see, Mark said many vendors don't have a way to automatically send the DEM files and it's all manual. Yeah, and so that needs to change. That needs to be an automated process, just like PCR data. To Matt's comment or question, thoughts on creating a schematron to help with the 3.5 shift. Yeah, only 3 states have a DEM dataset schematron file, whereas almost all of the states have a schematron file for patient care report data. And so states, this is an opportunity right here If you want to help agencies to ensure that they've set up their local software correctly, then if you start receiving their DEM data, and if you also put out a set of validation rules for their DEM data set, then you start having a way to evaluate the quality of their setup. To give one example, the state of Oregon is one of the 3 states that has a DEM data set schematron file. One of the things they check in there is that if someone on the personnel list is licensed at one of the Oregon EMS levels, EMR through paramedic, then their license number needs to match the 6-digit format that Oregon uses for EMS license numbers. If they're not licensed at one of those EMS license levels, then any number works. So that's one of the validation rules Oregon has that ensures that once we see the patient care report data, we're more likely to actually have correct license numbers in that data. Let's see. Is NEMSIS going to change the policy on DEM files and require them? NEMSIS at the national level requires them before PCRs can be sent. But Mark said he has an email from NEMSIS TAC saying once a year is fine. Yeah, today, as long as you've submitted the DEM data for an agency at least once, then you can just go ahead and submit PCR data for the rest of the future for that agency. And so what I'm suggesting here is that we do need to make a shift where DEM data gets submitted more frequently, both at the state level and the national level. Okay, we have made a couple of improvements in NEMSIS 3.5 to try to address these issues that got in the way of receiving and processing and sending demographic data like it should be. So one is demographic data had a handful of data elements in it, deconfiguration.02 through 05, sorry, that were information about the state. So this was asking the agency to tell us what the state allowed. Well, that's in state data set where it belongs. Now the state tells us with one file what they allow and what they collect. And so we've removed those elements from 3.5 DEM data set because they really are where they belong in state data set. We're no longer going to ask agencies to tell us what the state requires. Instead, let's focus on what the agency has set up. The second big change is the addition of the UUID. The UUID has gotten some press on the PCR side because we did add a UUID attribute to the patient care report element in EMS data set. The primary purpose or primary motivation for the UUID addition actually came from the demographic side. State level vendors said, here's our problem. The agency submits demographic data to us. We create a bunch of locations based on that data. Then they update their demographic data. They've made some changes to their locations. We can't tell which location is which because we don't have a key to identify each individual location in that data set, in that data package. And so then the state level system ends up creating a bunch of new locations, and all of a sudden in the state system, you have a bunch of duplicates. So the addition of the UUID was to address that issue. So state systems will now have a more robust way to identify when an object in demographic data changed as opposed to when one went away or one was added. There's some great details in the demographic data guide that really dive in to how to use the UUID to do just that. So if you're the developer of a state level system, then that would be recommended reading for you if you haven't already. Take a look at the demographic data processing guide. So we hope that these two changes start to kind of lubricate things, that we really can start to make that shift and pay more attention to demographic data and really get it flowing well. Let's see. Okay, Anne said, what to do if some agencies in our state follow medical direction of another state? For example, the allowed meds are different. They treat Arizona patients and send us those records, but they need to have other meds sent in. Does the S element of state meds allowed cause an issue with this type of submission? No, not unless you create a validation rule about it. So if you create a validation rule, in fact, Oregon has this validation rule too. It checks all of the medications and procedures on the agency's lists. And if there's a medication that the agency allows for EMRs that the state does not have on its list for EMRs, it has a warning about that, but not an error. So it won't reject the submission, but it does throw that warning. And at the state level, we can check into those. Did they just use the wrong code? They used a brand code when we wanted the ingredient code? Or are they allowing their EMR to carry a medication that's completely inappropriate? Or is this a reasonable exception because they work on the border of another state and they really do allow their EMRs to use that medication? All right, okay, so to wrap things up, I have some recommendations for all of you. First, for vendors that build state level products, I have two recommendations for you. One is to allow your state customers to be able to configure what and how demographic data is processed when it's received from local agencies. And the second is to automate your demographic data submissions to the national database so it doesn't happen just once, but it happens whenever updates occur. State data managers, I have a couple recommendations for you. One is to find a way to start accepting demographic data from agencies. This will probably need to be with your transition to NEMSIS 3.5, perhaps, because that's where we're solving the duplicate objects issue and some other stuff like that. But I would ask you to work that into your plan as a state and see if you can move in that direction. And if you do move in that direction, then it just makes sense that you're going to want to publish some schematron rules for your demographic data. And that's going to help improve the quality of the PCR data that you send. That you receive. And finally, vendors of agency level products, I have a couple of recommendations for you. One is to improve your demographic data validation. Make it more obvious to an agency data manager that they need to fill something out in their agency setup, or that something was wrong or something failed validation. Put a little more attention into the data validation in that area. And similarly to my recommendation for state vendors, agency level vendors, automate the data submission to the state, just like you have with PCRs. Just make it so that whenever a change happens, it just gets resent. Obviously, you're going to need to work with the state data manager to see when they will start accepting that data. But that's the vision that I wanted to present today for this shift into the future. I'll leave you with a few recommended resources. I mentioned the demographic data guide. The UUID guide is also important, and those are both on those usage guides page of the NEMSIS website. There's also a couple of helpful training webinars. They're actually a few years old now, but still helpful, both from 2018, one on agency demographic data, and another on EMS agency information and the NEMSIS v3 standard. So I recommend checking those out. Those are on the webinars pages of the NEMSIS website. Okay, I'm right up at like only 1 minute left with my time, but hopefully I addressed most of the questions that came up in the chat. Any other questions, as well as comments or concerns, things you think aren't going to work, things we still need to address? Okay, well, I appreciate everyone's attention for this presentation. I pushed at you a little bit today, but I think this is really a ripe area for some additional value that we can get from the NEMSIS standard. So thank you for considering these thoughts. Okay, so Ben, I guess I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thanks so much, Josh. And I will hand it over to Clay to talk about submission delays.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Great, great comments, and thank you for your participation so far today. This has been incredibly helpful. This is a day filled of lots of opportunity to get your feedback, and this has been incredibly helpful. this is another topic that we desperately need some feedback on. So I would very much appreciate if you'd be so forthcoming here as well. So one of the many issues we've talked about over the last 3 days that have been greatly affected by the pandemic was this idea of how quickly the EMS data is made available. And so as requested by the Office of EMS, we've been working over the last couple of months, just trying to collect some information regarding, when are records coming in? Are there pinch points? Are there bottlenecks? Are there areas where perhaps there is a little bit of a delay that may not be as necessary for technical reasons or for legal reasons or for billing reasons or other things like that that we could affect? And so, so far, all we've done is really collected some information. I hope during this next half hour, perhaps just to pick your brain a little bit, both on the state side as well as the vendor side, as to what we might be able to identify as some low-hanging fruit for us to move forward and trying to educate about the importance of more timely submissions. You'll see here, I've just listed some of the things that we've collected over the last couple of months. We've queried some agencies and received some information from them. They could be waiting for information to complete a patient care report, information coming back from the hospital, a patient name when the patient was unconscious, or some billing information. There's long extended shifts with a clinician not coming back on shift for 7 days, 10 days. And so if they haven't closed out a record, it may sit for a long period before completed. QA processes. On the state side, there's clearly some outdated expectations in some states, maybe when they expect to see records haven't been updated for a number of years, maybe even since the records have become electronic. And then there's reasons why they may request that records be held until they're final for some type of a legal reason. And PW&W spoke to that a little bit on day one. So you can read through these and see kind of what the reasons were that we collected. And we'll come back to this slide again. I do want to try to just highlight for just a couple of quick minutes why this is important, why submission timeliness is so important. Clearly, it's true that the NEMSIS data collection system, the information system is much different than other registries that may be held in states, in that we do have a web services process that could really allow the records to be very timely, right? And during the pandemic and after the pandemic, there's been a number of reasons, both at the almost the local and the state and the national level, can see the value for having that data very quickly. Here's a great article that came out. Joe is a medical student. He published this in JAMA. This came out in the spring of 2021. He was basically looking for deaths from overdose. And I'll just describe this chart real quickly. You'll see each of the dots on the chart represents a month within a year. So you can see in 2020, when we finished this project for his fellowship, only 7 months of 2020 data was available, the orange dots. But what we have on the y-axis is the NEMSIS data, the rate per 100,000 EMS activations where there was a cardiac arrest due to an overdose. And so you have that rate on the y-axis. And then what he did is he went to the CDC and collected what was called provisional deaths by the CDC for those months. It was called provisional, even though he was requesting this data 6 months. The data could have been collected and aggregated and cleaned for 6 months before made available. It was still considered provisional, much like our registries across the states, right, where it can take, in many cases, years to release data. So these were provisional numbers. But what's interesting to point out here, right, is if there was a perfect correlation, clearly the two scales are different. One is deaths and one is a rate. But if if the two were perfectly correlated, right? So if you could predict deaths by this rate, or if you could predict the rate by these deaths, this R that's listed right here would be 1, right? These would perfectly line up on this black line. What's incredibly valuable here, of course, to point out is that it is very close to 1. You don't see these types of correlations just in nature, right? This was incredible, right? And it points to the idea that the NEMSIS data, which is basically 2 weeks old at the national level, could distinctly predict by month across the nation the number of deaths that you would expect to see from overdoses, available in 2 weeks instead of available in 6 to 9 months. So incredibly valuable as a surveillance system. So this is a little bit abstract. What if we tried to look at it in a more straightforward way? So this is a chart that that Dr. Newton in Georgia was kind enough to allow me to share on this presentation. Thank you. This is a graph of Georgia data that was prepared using biospatial and David there in the Department of Health in Georgia. What you see here is the number of EMS calls related to ILI in green, and here in the light blue you have confirmed cases that were collected, aggregated within the state of Georgia. And of course, what's incredibly valuable here is starting at June 1, you see this near perfect correlation, right? Where the number of calls that EMS is receiving related to ILI, though clearly everyone doesn't call EMS when they have influenza-like illness symptoms, but the correlation is just so incredibly tight. What's also interesting is before June 1, you see this period that has been pointed out in all types of literature, this area of concern of not yet understanding what is COVID. I've got symptoms that the CDC is talking about that I don't understand. I'm going to call 911. So you can see when we did the initial shelter in place, community spread was talked about. There was this anxiety and more calls probably for ILI than were actually related to COVID. But clearly, the correlation here is just incredible. So it again just really points to the idea that if we have timely data, we have an incredibly powerful bellwether of what you expect to see in communities related to an infectious disease, for example. So hopefully many states were able to do something like this and saw something similar. I'm gonna just quickly bring up, I apologize, that isn't the one I wanted to bring up. Let me just quickly bring up the ILI dashboard that we have available right today. So Julianne was kind enough to go ahead and pull this data for me today. I'm gonna show it to you, and of course my heart drops a little bit, right? Because we're seeing another uptick, right? So here's the data. Here's the value of us having this data on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, right? Where we can provide information to the CDC. You within states can provide information to your leaders in your state that, hey, we could be facing something very important again. But what's interesting here, right, is this again is a rate. It's the number. It's the percentage of ILI related activations to all activations. But this will represent some states more than other states, right? Because of the lag that can be present in some states before data is submitted. So that's the topic that I want to talk about just real briefly. So what's interesting, I'll just point this out. So here's an example of what is seen in Georgia. Let's just take a quick look at what we see based on the nation, also based on what I just showed you, right? So I just showed you the rate of influenza-like illness calls across the country. And look how closely it continues at a national level to trend with actual reported COVID cases. This was is a graph that was reported to the Office of EMS on a call Tuesday morning from the CDC directly from their tracker. So again, it's just incredible that we can provide this information for the CDC that can be incredibly helpful. It's now easier to count cases, right? We've figured out how to do that, but if you were to look at COVID deaths or other things, just like Joe is able to do, you'd see this. You'd see the same correlation. So this is incredibly valuable. What can we do to try to improve the timeliness of the data? Because it's important for the states. I know that we've talked to several states about this idea, and let's kind of walk through it. There's a couple of issues that are important for us to talk about. The first one is this that I want to point out is that, and I'm looking for comments from states and from vendors here. So please, if you'd help with this, this would be incredibly valuable. If I look at submission lag for the same time period, I tried to just grab a recent time period, so just the first week in July. When I look at the submission lag to receive 75% of the records that occur on any given day, in 2020, it was about 187 hours, so roughly 8 days, I guess. In 2021, and beginning with the beginning of the year, something strange happened where now our data is much more dated, where now we're waiting 530 hours to reach 75% of the records that occur in any day. So while we're approaching like 22 days, right? So what was the shift? And I'll just show you briefly what happened because of that. So folks will know EMS by the numbers comes out weekly, and it's been incredibly a powerful tool for EMS at many levels. It's used by lots of organizations. We built in a 2-week lag so that we allowed records to aggregate, and that worked in 2020 because I just showed you in 2 weeks, you really had the bulk of the data that was occurring over the year. But you can see now for 2021, we see this every week when we provide this out because the records haven't come in. We're now at 22 days instead of less than 10 days. So I'm gonna pause there just real quickly, and I apologize, I haven't been checking the chat, but are there reasons at the vendor level or at the state level why submission lag to the national level has become so prolonged?
Clay, it's Josh. In the state of Oregon, we simply discovered that the state system had a 24-hour lag built into the criteria for the export to national. And we just asked the vendor to remove that. That immediately sped Oregon up by about a day.
Great. Thank you, Josh. Yeah, that's good. That's great to hear that was discovered. How about from the vendor side? Any comment about why there may be a prolonged submission lag now with 2021? Was there something that was requested by states in 2020 to be more timely that was turned off, or something like that?
I'd probably say we need to drill into that line a little bit to get a better idea. We're not aware of anything that changed either on state levels or in our clients.
Yeah, this is Adam. Hopefully you could hear me. But yeah, I haven't done a study yet, but it's a good point. And I'm actually taking notes to try to dive into it. The only thing I could possibly guess is obviously we had always more slightly more states, but in particularly ET3 that maybe have added to queuing backlogs. So I mean, all of us generate these and send them out somehow. Maybe just volume related. That's just a random guess.
Okay, that's a great comment. I hadn't thought of that, so maybe you're right, Adam. We can look into that. Yeah, I'd love you to drill in and see if you find anything on your side. And thank you. Aaron had a great point too in regards to QA reviews, and maybe they were skipped in 2020. And Karin, thank you for the information regarding South Dakota.
Hey, Clay, this is
yeah.
Samantha with ESO. We don't have any, we have not had any requests from states to slow our submissions down. But what we have seen over the space of the last 2 years is a trend, which we did talk about earlier, the schematron rules that require facility codes and names to match can cause huge problems. And most of those rules are fatal errors. So that would completely block a submission until it can get fixed. And we see lots of those. So I would say something to consider is the number of fatal errors at the state schematron level can be slowing that down as well.
Okay. Yeah, good comment, Samantha.
Hey, Clay, this is Ann in Arizona. I was wondering if, I don't know if all states would be interested, but I know I would be interested in getting some kind of, I don't know exactly what data I would need, but some kind of breakdown for my state to see if you're seeing a lag from us, so that I can maybe investigate if we're also seeing a lag in 2021. We haven't looked at that. I haven't noticed anything, but, and like I said, I ran overall state numbers, but it might be something that we're unaware of that's coming from the agencies, or maybe the agencies are getting their data to us as they have been fairly quickly in our system. And I'd like to be able to differentiate.
Okay, and that sounds good. We'll do that.
Is it consistent nationally, or what can you tell us more about the data? Is it, I mean, if something goes sideways in California and New York, it has an outsized effect on those. I know New York's schematron did change recently.
Right.
If that's
right. We've tried to do some investigation on the state side. We're kind of digging into this after collecting the preliminary information. So it's a great comment, David, and we'll build into this or kind of dig into this, kind of stratifying this delay by software and by state. But I was interested if folks just know prospectively about things that have happened. These ideas are incredibly valuable, really helpful. Yeah, just looking through the comments here. Thank you. Jay asks a great question. We'll try to define that more clearly, Jay. That's incredibly helpful. QC reviews for small agencies, right? Could delay submissions. Thank you, Chris. Any other big ticket ideas? Jay's comment is very good, and we worked with Jay a lot because Jay has done a lot of work in Wyoming to address submission lag, and we've been working on how we can show data in a more correct fashion for states, because we kind of get the data after perhaps billing may have put a hold on a record or something like that, depending on the system and the software used. So our data is jaded, right? So Jay in Wyoming may see very different delay times than we see, just based on the flow of data. And we're working to improve that process. Yeah, thank you for the idea. So this is incredibly helpful. We'll continue to dig into this, and we'll report back to you on the implementation calls, kind of what's going on there. Let's kind of leave that national look here and see if we can dig in a little bit to another area that would be interesting to talk about, and see if there's something that we can do to kind of work on this. This is some great work that Monet put together, and thank you very much, the data managers, for being willing to provide this data. This is available on the website, and we've talked to the DMC about this. This is, Monet was able to collect from all the states what is their expectation or perhaps even a rule within their state in regards to how quickly data should be turned around, right? So what is the expectation within states as to how quickly data is submitted to the state? And you can see it varies to a great degree, right? When I look at some of these states and see, 45 days, 60 days before records are expected to be submitted, that almost feels like this was back in the paper days, right? So I don't know if it's true for some of these states that these expectations have never been updated, but it does kind of feel like that, right? The work that Jay did in Wyoming, they have an expectation of 2 hours, right? So there is a big difference here. When we actually look at the data that comes in, it kind of feels like that, right? When we compare two states that have very big differences in what the expectation is or what the rule is, right? I don't know that Jay has any teeth behind his rule in Wyoming. He could speak to that a little bit. And in fact, I may want him to talk about that if he'd be willing in just a moment. But you can see that his delay time that we record here after those comments I made a moment ago, he probably sees the data much more quickly than we do. But it's for us, it's 4 days, right? When we compare that to Iowa, and it's 378 hours, so about 16 days. So these correlate very well with expectations based on the information that Monet provided. So with kind of that backdrop in mind, I wanted to make sure that I'm saving some time for us to talk a little bit about maybe what are some low-hanging fruit that maybe the NEMSIS TAC and the Office of EMS could work on to help the states with the timeliness of data and at the national repository as well, because I think the return on investment for the utilization of NEMSIS data at the national level, and thus being able to provide states with funding to keep their systems up and running. Part of that return on investment is proven through the timeliness of the data. So maybe we could dig in. I could dig in a little bit here, and I would love some comments. I just threw up some ideas here that we talked about or we heard from states, and I just want to know whether these are true or whether we need to dig into them deeper. One of the ideas was that this idea that states, and Ryan spoke to this on Monday, can data be added to a record later? That maybe there's this expectation that a record needs to be held in a temporary location before it's finalized into a state warehouse until it's, quote, final. And so states or maybe even vendors aren't utilizing kind of a wipe and replace if an agency was to update a record and just like be continually updating it, but having the records be available for counting and for use in reporting. Is that true?
Definitely true, yes. Some states utilize the scoring mechanism of their repository to assign a grade to the agency, and then in turn the agencies will either tie the score of the TCR to compensation for the medics, or may even discipline them for not having their record, not having all passing things. We've seen that.
So David, so the idea is you have to reach a certain score before the record would move on into a data mart for reporting or some other purposes. It's got to reach a certain score before it can be finalized and used. Is that the idea?
It's physically possible, but the agency doesn't want them to do that because they want to keep their score up from the states.
Oh, from the first submission. Got it. Okay, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, thank you. Your other vendors or states? States, do you require, for example, that an agency hold onto a record until a certain score is approached, or until some proportion of the record is complete, or some idea like that before it's finalized and sent?
Hey, Clay, this is Brian in Virginia. Yeah, we actually prefer the agencies send us the records as soon as they're available, because we have a lot of hospital connections with different programs. But we do want the agencies to have a final record to us within 7 days. So we try to give them that 7-day window to improve their data quality. So we do allow the agencies to submit changes even after 7 days. But our requirement is to try to have that final record over to us within 7 days.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I wasn't watching the chat. Wow, lots of good comments in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, this is great. This will be helpful. And Mark, we're going to dig into this issue in just a minute. So thank you for bringing that up. I know we've talked about that. So thanks, Mark. Let's see. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Some great ideas. Let me see how quickly I need to move. Oh yeah, I need to be able to move forward. So yeah, thank you for putting it in the chat. Yeah, if you have other comments about these questions, please put them in chat. That would be incredibly valuable. I have one more screen I want to get to, and it speaks to something that Mark's mentioned here as well. And we talked about the schematron issues, particularly related to facilities. So thank you. That's been something that has kind of come to light based on this meeting. So that's been incredibly helpful. Thank you. There was some, when we brought this to the DMC, there was some talk about this idea. Well, if the Office of EMS at NHTSA provided an expectation as for what they'd like to see in regards to a submission timeline, or expectation for when a record should be completed, I just in chat, or if you want to just voice your opinion as a state, would this be valuable? So with some of the expectations that clearly look like maybe you might want to modify those. I don't know what kind of demands you're being asked by your state to become more timely. I imagine this is an issue for many states now after the initial pandemic. Would it be valuable to have a statement from the Office of EMS? Okay, thank you, Anne. Any other states? Thank you, Ridgely. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, other states, if you'd put your comments in there, that would be incredibly helpful. We've talked about the quality scoring. That's been great to hear comments on that. Thank you very much. I want to get to the last point here just real briefly. Mark has talked about this idea that he Mark's been mostly on chat, so I'll try to rephrase what we've talked about, Mark. And if you can't come off chat, or if you can speak, that's great. But if not, that's also fine. The idea that he has set a process in place that reduced the kind of back and forth of like resubmitting EPCRs many times as the record is updated with additional information. They put processes in place to reduce that traffic. And I didn't know, Mark, we haven't had a chance to talk about it much. I didn't know if that was truly a resource utilization bottleneck. I know in California, some of the records are prolonged coming to us because there is kind of a bottleneck, but I wasn't sure whether you actually saw real reductions in the timeliness of data flow. I know you were seeing like millions of transactions happening. Is that right, Mark? Are you able to come off mute?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here. Yeah, I mean, I was seeing the same record come in 3, 4, 5 times, and every night I get a recap of what happened the prior day, of how many records came in, how many failed, what the hour of the day was, by hour, what the volumes were. And I could just see all these coming in, and repeated. And so I went to some of the agencies and I said, hey, just hold them for 24 to 48 hours, because obviously your process is causing them to be re-triggered. Every time somebody opens it, it's being re-triggered.
Yeah.
And that seemed to help considerably with just getting all these duplicates. The other problem that we were having is that with our vendor, every time a new record comes in, it soft deletes the old one. And so we were burning up storage like crazy, because if it says we had 1,000 records, we might have 3,000 that are soft deleted that are still taking up space. So since we self-host, it was a big, huge issue.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense.
So it kind of was both. You'll notice I had to turn our submissions off last night. I'm coming clean. We've got a problem, and you're the first one that gets turned off when we have a problem. So hopefully it'll be resolved tonight, and then I'll turn it back on. But if I'm sending 20,000 a day and I'm getting 22,000 in, I'm not caught up.
Yeah. Got it. Are there any other states that have kind of went through this same kind of process that Mark's talking about and made those same kind of decisions? Okay, great. Yeah, and yeah, please.
Clay, I would like to say one thing, and that is that majority of ours come in within hours of having been completed. It's these larger ones that are throwing our numbers off. But if we looked at the smaller ones, they are coming in. I mean, usually the same day or within hours of being completed. It's just these large volume agencies, AMR, that, kind of slow us down a little bit.
Okay. I'm a little bit over here. Any last comments from states? We'll dig into this more. I think we've got some great information here to provide some more evidence, some more information to individual states that could be helpful. Are there other comments we want to make sure we get out regarding this topic, either from the vendor side or the state side? Okay. Thank you very much for this. This will provide us with some good information or some good ideas that we can generate some additional information to dig in a little bit deeper here and see if we can provide some educational tools that will help us as a nation to be able to provide data in a more timely fashion. I think there's great opportunities and possibilities for NEMSIS to become an incredibly powerful tool in this country, right down to the community level understanding of what's happening. And part of that has to be related to the timeliness of data. So Ben, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Clay. We are headed into a 15-minute break. We're doing okay on time. If everyone could be back at 11, we'll say 11:45, and then we'll turn things over to Julianne.
All right, we'll spend just a few minutes talking about this. We have talked about defined lists a few times. So this one will not be a rehash of why we need them. Actually, I take that back. There is a little bit of why we need them. Just a introduction, I guess. So in these few minutes, we're asking for you to help us understand what you see as the best way to move forward. And we recognize that some states have a lot of influence over what their agency submits, and some have little to no influence. We're looking for that continued feedback. What do you think? What do you need? What do you want? We take all these ideas, we work through them throughout the year. We're trying to get a good idea of what's important for you to see standardized at the national level. And we've recognized, if everyone does their own thing, that EMS data are cloudy. Policymakers and researchers
have to make more assumptions with the data. So we're just trying to tighten it up a little bit. So field complaints. I am confident that many of you on this call have heard these complaints. Long lists of codes are the second most common complaint that we hear from the field. The first one is that there are too many mandatory fields. That one's pretty common, but you know, this is specific feedback from clinicians about the impact that long lists have on them in the field. So the primary concern with these defined lists is not that it's a roll-up issue. It's an issue that codes can only be rolled up and the needed EMS specificity is lost. Many of you bring up that topic when we've discussed defined list, how to keep the field specificity, but also how to keep it succinct enough to facilitate good documentation, but not burdensome documentation. So when agencies are using different codes for the same type of incident, the state and national roll-up loses that specificity for research, for QA/QI, policy and procedure improvements. One field product that uses unspecified fall for all falls, you know, and there's others that use specifics like fall from bed, fall from shower, fall from stairs. How does an agency, state, nation make evidence-based change if the data are not consistent? When we look at causes of injury, and I just pulled 2019 because it was right there in a report that we were working on, falls make up, and I'm using falls as an example. Falls are just tons and tons of the 911 responses that are done each year. Falls make up 10 out of the top 20 causes of injury. And when we're trying to gain some of that specificity, we lose that with some of that roll up. So if fall from bed is really important, then it needs to stay on the list. But is fall from chair, toilet, fall from furniture, fall in shower different? When the clinician takes the time to be specific, it can get discarded with roll up if there's not a standardized method to the madness. Clinicians, they probably like perhaps a dozen categories for fall, but not 50. So how do we allow them to be specific and succinct for 911 responses, and then keep it within a sensible category? It's that balance of controlled specificity. So here's where we're going to get into the questions. Are states willing to say, this is what we want to capture? Will the state support a process with timely updates and what needs to be captured and how? I'm going to leave these three, I'm going to tell you these three questions. I'm going to leave these up here for a few minutes to get some feedback. You know, we'll keep updating and modifying, but how do we get the best buy-in and ensure that agencies actually see the lists? So 3 questions thrown out to you. You know, the top one, the first few are specific to states, but that third question that's for everybody. You know, how do we get the best buy-in and ensure that agencies actually see the modified list or the defined lists? So Mark's got a good point. They still have local requirements that add to what the state requires. So that would be a compounding factor too. In here's what your state needs, and then the locals have. Is that like your local, your NEMSIS, or is that in an agency level? Are you seeing agencies that are saying, here's what the state wants, but then we're adding, you know, these different things because it's common to what we're doing? All right, Mark's comment is could be both. What about with the other states? What is it something that you're willing to say this is what we want to capture, or do you already specify defined lists for those long codes? Are states willing to support a process with timely updates on what needs to be captured and how it should be captured? Yep, really good point, Jay. Or actually, that first one was from Mark, and then that went through really fast on me. Agencies that bill have more requirements than those that don't. Yep, billing's a huge issue. Jay says it's a balancing act to satisfy all the providers. One provider says the system makes me document false information, and we need to update the definition of impression. Oh, okay, that's a different tangent. Update the definition of impression to be a general category or some other wording. Just a thought there. Good thought, James. James with Stryker, different codes accepted for NEMSIS as it is for state, as it is for billing. Yep, it's an issue with that consistency there. And Anne, in Arizona, they don't restrict any submissions of impressions, but you do have a list, and it could be more streamlined and would support it. Okay. And defined lists specifically are implemented in 3.5. So it doesn't affect the schematron. This will be a process where defined lists will be able to be a little bit more responsive to industry needs as far as additions and changes. We'll talk about that a little bit too. So let's talk for a minute about uptake of new codes. If we provided really timely review and acceptance of new codes or revisions of codes, would states and agencies provide input? Do you want those recommendations to have broad approval past a review committee, or does that just slow it down unnecessarily, like we saw with the COVID codes? How often would states and vendors be willing to update their lists? And how long does a vendor need to implement a change? And what about states implementing a change? Is there a difference in work between adding new codes or removing codes? So we've got questions here to kind of spur that conversation from a state perspective and from a vendor perspective of uptake of new codes, of keeping them current. Help us understand the downstream work that's required when a defined list is updated. How does that impact you?
Julian, this is Samantha with ESO, and I just want to verify that the defined lists, like impressions, vendors could still add codes that meet the ICD-10 pattern, but are outside of the defined list. I need to make sure that's still the truth here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that is because we recognize as the defined lists are developed, the primary audience is 911 response. So they're not going to be enough for critical care transports, maybe not enough for community paramedicine or mobile home health. So yes, codes, the defined list won't be locked down. Codes that fit the pattern will still be able to be added to those.
Perfect, because that's exactly, you nailed the reasons of why I needed that. So perfect.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of different need in those other areas.
Yeah. Since I still have my mic off, if there was like a schedule that we knew the TAC was working on, then we could more easily plan for it. And the development planning would be kind of, I guess, my biggest roadblock for keeping the list current, what you're changing.
So how long does it take to make a change like that? Do we need to, I know we've talked about other changes to schematron or to different aspects of the standard where defined lists are not in the schematron. Are they a little bit quicker to implement if there are additions or changes?
Absolutely, they are. We're just we like to make sure everything that goes into our production environment goes through a full cycle. So it just has to go through the whole process. That's where would be with that. But yes, it is simple work. It's easy. You know, if we weren't going through all the QA part of it, it would be really quick. So.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Sam.
Julian,
Yes, go ahead, Keenan.
I think as we have these discussions, and we've been having them for quite a while now, I feel like a lot of times what happens is us on the vendor community, we stand up, and a couple of states will stand up and say, hey, this amount of change, especially frequently, is not really great for our customers and our vendor, or our customers and our agencies. And I'm wondering how much input we've gotten from agencies directly, either back to the state level or back to this group or NEMSIS TAC, to sort of address these frequent changes, right? Every time we change something in a system, we get blowback. And I just want to make sure that we're actually creating more good than harm here.
Absolutely. It's a good point, Keenan. Thank you. And the direct feedback that we get from clinicians is the lists are too long. So it's not even that the lists are that they're too specific. It's just that they're having to filter through too many options. And we recognize that part of that is based on the product that they use, and whether or not that smart logic is implemented in the product that they're using in the field. And we're trying to be really careful about the changes, but also be responsive to the needs of the industry. Elizabeth brings up that it's still missing the U codes in the ICD-10s. And you know, when we looked at adding or identifying values to use for COVID, the U codes were brought up, but U codes are generally emergency temporary codes, and it could take a while before ICD-10 adds a permanent home for an emerging issue. So, you know, how do we keep current without overburdening the clinician?
I think that's really my question. Is I understand that clinicians think the list too long. I think they're too long too. I hate them. But do we introduce a new problem of now the lists are shorter and more manageable, but they change every 6 months? And once I've learned the list, now I have to learn a new list. Is that what we're gonna find?
Yeah,
We will. Oh, go ahead, Clay.
Yeah, Keenan raises a great point. I mean, I'm trying to look into a crystal ball as Keenan is, right? I mean, his concern is real. I think that there's kind of 2 points here. I think one is what's the core set of codes that everybody kind of needs to have, right? And that's what we've tried to do with the defined list, by ensuring that when we looked at all the past year's data, ensured that 90% of the codes were represented by these. That should reduce that continued variability. I don't, and I'll mention that one of Keenan's questions was, how does the providers review these lists? And I'll just mention that Eric has, there's a handful of providers on the internal advisory board, and one of their tasks is to review those lists. And so that it only represents a handful of providers. But I think, Keenan, once the idea would not be to come up with, oh, okay, we've used this code for cardiac arrest. Hey, let's change it to this code. I don't think that will happen. And so I think we probably have the bulk of codes. I think what will happen and will be valuable, right, is when electronic scooters or electronic bikes come on the scene, for example, then we'd have a national approach for adding those codes. But yeah, Keenan, you're right. We can't just be changing these codes because some academic thinks that this is the more correct ICD-10 code to use. That's not our intention here.
Clay, let me ask a question here, and it goes to what Keenan said. And Keenan, you're right on target. And it's a question that I get, and I get beat up when we talk about this in other meetings as well. But here's my like grand perspective on these optional codes and lists. So we have these defined lists now, and these things are massive, and people are complaining about them. Yet we still have states adding custom codes to them, or adding different elements, or claiming that there needs to be an additional element. So what I struggle with when someone tells me they need a custom element at a state, the first thing I think of is what are they doing that's so unique there that they need something that's not already captured? And there will be new things like that. And Clay's example is a good one with new types of electronic bicycles or classification of bicycles or hoverboards or different types of things like that. That's probably a pretty good example. But I struggle with the concept of adding a code to a drop-down list creates this need for a whole new retraining and a whole new perspective from the EMS personnel on that particular code. Or is it something just as simple as an email or directive that goes out and says, hey, there's something new in this list to consider now related to hoverboards because they're the new thing for micromobility.
So Eric, this is Mark Roberts. What I've heard over the years about some of these needs to add fields is there are some states out there that can't make any changes unless it comes from the top. And so while they want something local, sometimes it gets pushed out on us because that's the only way they can get it into their system. And that's not, that's not right, but that is,
I hear you, Mark. I mean, we're in the same, just think of the conversation we just had earlier about delay. Clay asked the question, how many states would like DOT or NHTSA to say you should have reports come to the state level in X number of hours or by the end of shift or whatever the actual number would be or term would be. And, people ask for that from us because, it's pointing the finger at NHTSA and saying, well, that's a NHTSA requirement and they're putting that on us. So I completely understand where you're coming from on that. I guess I am 100%, and I said this from day one when I started with this project, variation drives me crazy. And I've had the opportunity to work with ambulance services and EMS in all 50 states now in 14 countries. And people start off their conversations with, but you don't understand, we're different. And I got news for you. You're really not. You might be operationally different in the way you manage things, but in terms of cardiac arrest and people with gunshot wounds, you don't bleed differently on one side of this country than you do the other. So that's where it's a struggle for me to understand some of these things. And that's sort of my perspective when we start talking about shortening lists and making changes. And I'll just add one other piece. And I talked with the TAC about this last night. Clay talked about and asked a question about the frequency of adding or changing or revising codes. And I take it one step further and say, how do we do that more in a more agile manner? Because, I've got a list of people that want to make changes to these things on a daily basis. And we tell them, look, we're waiting on version 3.5 to roll out. Well, when is that coming out? Well, it's going to be at least a year and probably longer because we're talking about whether or not we want to extend it. So it's this, it seems like we're always holding somebody back and pushing somebody forward. And any ways that we can do that to lessen the burden on someone, I'm more than willing to listen. Over.
Thank you. Good conversation. And there's some more in the chat too that we'll try and get to. I don't know if we'll hit those today. I'm just going to bring up one other set of questions before we move on to the next topic. So when we're looking at formatting of these lists, as states are looking to implement 3.5 and the impact that it will have, is there anything that's not working well for agencies or states? Are there modifications that we can continue to make or recommend that will support that uptake.
Hey,
Are there,
Julianne?
yes, go ahead.
Maybe we can call on Josh, if you'd be so kind, Josh. I may be putting you on the spot here, but could you, and we've got time because it's Eric and I right after this. Could you describe briefly the model we're proposing for the different formats and how that will be valuable? Julianne asked a great question, but I'm not sure that both the states and the vendors kind of understand that process.
Yeah, there is a plan to provide the defined lists in different formats than what's out there now. So currently the suggested lists are in Excel format, and there's various formatting, you know, color highlighting, and it'd be hard to computer process those Excel files. So the plan is to provide the defined lists in some standard validatable formats. One will be XML, one will be JSON, one will be CSV, which so you could still bring it up in Excel, and then in a web format, HTML, which would allow people to just kind of browse the lists on the NEMSIS website.
Right, Josh, can you talk a little bit about the value of maybe being able to do diffs, right? I mean, one of the real values will be that they'll be machine readable right away. They'll be able to incorporate them easily, but also do comparisons. Like if you added a field or or needed to compare to an agency list, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So as everyone knows, all these resources go into a Git repository, and when you've got stuff in a Git repository, you can do diffs on the different versions of a file. But when you try to do a diff on an Excel file or a Word document or a PDF, you're sometimes limited in how you can diff that because they're just binary files. But all these formats that we'll be using, the XML, JSON, CSV, will be easy to do diffs on because they're all text-based. So it should be, you know, for a vendor, it'd be pretty quick to see exactly which line was added to the file on the latest update.
Thank you, Josh. And all those, we'll put all of those in Git and not on the website because it'll be multiple files per list.
So thank you, Julianne. Yeah, sorry, but that kind of keys up your question, right? Is that enough, right? Is that enough to make these lists more agile?
Thank you. That's a good point. Is there any blowback that states are experiencing from agencies not wanting to have more clearly defined lists? Are there any struggles at the state level?
I think as long as agencies would have an easy way to add something if they needed it or felt they needed it, or to document it so they wouldn't have to misdocument something. I think most agencies still want something easy they can just implement and not have to go through a huge list or figure out what other people are using, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Anne. That standardization, but still a little bit of ability to do small customizations. Okay. And not all the states, thank you, Karin, not all the states have pushed out that defined lists will be a part of that 3.5 implementation. So that'll be an education piece as well as you're implementing 3.5. So this next set of questions goes to that connecting with our agencies better. Yeah, was somebody gonna?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think I've told my agencies, for example, that there will be this thing called defined list, but I haven't gone into a lot of detail because I think it's going to be a front end display. And I don't know how to explain to them what it's going to look like because I have no idea what it's going to look like in the different products. So it's hard to answer any questions when you kind of say, we have this thing, I don't know what it's going to look like or really how it's going to work. But, and I'm not being sarcastic, it's just hard to kind of bring that up and then have no answers.
Right. And so much of it depends on that user interface that they'll experience in the field. And Keenan asks if billing agencies were included in the internal stakeholder meeting. And yes, we have one that's represented in those internal discussions. So that was a recommendation that you guys made early on, that the lists would not be made without or finalized without some input from billing. And like a lot of the agencies and locales, there's so much variation in what billing agencies are looking for, that it's reflective of that difficulty in that national standardization. All right, and Mark brings up, we all have to deal with special projects and trial studies. Naloxone distribution, absolutely. The distribution, the leave behind, we're certainly seeing that in some areas. Not everybody is having those same issues. So it's harder to do a national standardization, but it's a good point.
Yeah, and that's a great example of where several different states have reached out to us and said, hey, we've got this new leave on naloxone behind. What code do you want us to use? What code should we be using? So that's another great example of trying to address that quickly and provide a code out to everybody that's the same, right?
Yep. So Lori did a great job getting lots of great feedback on the education and training. Defined lists will not be excluded from that education and awareness. It's on the list of things that need to be promoted, but we'd love any suggestions or best practices on how best to educate the use and adoption of defined lists, how to really connect at the field level and with the clinicians and the agencies. So there's that understanding of why they're selecting specific codes and not just trying to find the first thing that jumps out because they want to be done with the record, but be able to whittle down that list enough that it makes sense for an EMS encounter and not just the wide world of medical coding. Karin, okay, an article in EMS magazines, paper or online. It's a great suggestion. Thank you, Karin. Do you find that, do online articles hit that front line, the clinician and agency level? Are there other ways that you're connecting with the field for getting out your promotions or your new initiatives? Any examples on what's been successful? So as ideas come to you, please feel free to share. We'll continue to build out materials. And if we hit the mark or if we totally miss the mark, we really rely on you to let us know. This was, do more like this, or nope, this talks to data and, appeals to our epidemiologists, but doesn't appeal whatsoever to the field. We appreciate that feedback, and we rely on you for that inside look on what's going to really help promote that buy-in for the field, for agency, for clinicians, and we appreciate that feedback. Karin, thank you for your comments. Yep, state newsletters as well. All right, we're gonna close out this one on suggested lists. We have spent a lot of time talking about suggested lists. or define lists, I'm sorry. And we probably will for a while still, until 3.5 is fully implemented. We'll still have some more discussions on making sure that we're doing the right education, we're doing the right amount of updates, but not having it be burdensome. So we'll keep talking about it for a little bit longer. Thank you, everyone. And please feel free to shoot us an email. We're happy to take your comments and suggestions as well. All right, Ben, you wanna?
Yeah, I'm actually going to hand things over now to Clay and Eric, and we're going to do some kind of open question and answers and discussion.
Fantastic. I will go ahead and start if Eric would be so kind as to unmute as well. We're going to tag team. Mark asked that we provide the final poll numbers related to whether or not there was an interest in extending the V 3.4 closure date and or extending the 3.5 rollout dates. And so I'll just show you the final numbers from the polls. Eric and I had a chance to talk about this last night. Eric, I'll just show these, and if you'd be willing to kind of share your perspective about what you were thinking we should do next, and we'd love to collect some additional information if folks are interested. Here's the poll related to should we extend the 3.4 closure date. 67% said yes. Should we extend the 3.5 timeline? 73% of this audience said yes. So Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Clay. So we'll take these and go back to our meetings with the the state directors. We have one coming up, if I'm not mistaken, in the next 2 weeks, and talk with them. I was reminded very early on in this process, and I'm not disrespecting our data managers on here because you guys are awesome. And I know you're a hardworking group of people and you're pulled 50 different directions. There's no doubt in my mind. But I was told very bluntly that you do not speak for the state directors. So I need to talk with the state directors. We will share this data with them. I'm glad we had the opportunity to ask it. I guess my personal bias is that it's pretty strongly in favor of pushing it back. My question is, how long do you push it back then? And the other big concern is, are we falling into the trap that, we just keep pushing it back until we finally draw a line in the sand and force people to start moving forward? I'll go back to the comment I made just a couple minutes ago. We're always pushing somebody forward and holding somebody back. I know there are agencies that want to do more jazzy high-tech things, and there are software vendors out there that are prepared to help them do that. So in some ways we may be slowing that down. It's very difficult for us to sustain many versions, and we tried to avoid that early on. We did the extension of the 3.3.4 just basically at the request, and I believe that was Florida, Texas, and somebody else, I can't remember. And that's back to the last in-person NEMSIS meeting that we held. So that's been quite a while. So, I mean, those are my thoughts. We'll certainly take it forward. I have no problems with if that's where the industry needs to be. I don't want to lose states. I don't want to lose state data, and I don't want to create a system where we're pulling in garbage. So bottom line, we'll see what the state directors have to say, and then we'll take our direction from there.
Thank you, Eric. Any comments one way or another that you want to pass off to Eric? One of the questions that he asked is about if 3.4 was to be extended or 3.5 was to be extended. Is there a amount that folks want to share?
So is this, I think I'm not quite understanding. So is this about extending 3.4 or delaying the introduction of 3.5?
David,
both.
it could be, I guess, either or, David, depending on the perspective, but I'll have Clay speak to that.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, we could review each of these, right? So the closure date right now for 3-4 is January of 2023. So that it would be an amount of time that we would extend that if there's interest in that. That was the 63% in favor of extending that.
Okay, so it's more about the 3.4 than 3.5. Is that sound?
I think so, David. I think it's two different questions. The 3.5 is interesting, right? All we do here is indicate when it rolled out and when we expect things to be available. I think states like this for 3.5, because they're interested in being able to go to their leadership and say, hey, here's when we expect to see the software available. Can we go ahead and start making some plans for when we'd like to ask people to move to 3.5, right? So this is a little less tangible than the closure of a data set for national elements. But yeah, the question is to both. And we may be adding more time to one and less to another. It doesn't need to be the same amount, right?
So Clay and everybody in South Dakota, the response was, the second half of 2022 for having a system available. South Dakota hadn't really thought about when all agencies needed to be moved over.
Mm-hmm.
In a perfect world, it would be within a 3 to 6 months period, but that's typically pretty hard to do for anybody. So we still want version 3.50 to be available. We just think that, especially looking at the nation as a whole, version 3.40 cannot close December 31st of 2022. It needs to be extended, but let's move forward with version 3.50. South Dakota is interested in figuring out how we can implement it.
Right. Thanks, Karen. And Mark stated yesterday that for his large state that it's a 3-year process to move everybody over. Now that would move this timeline out a lot, right? I don't. Maybe we need to provide some motivation to California, but it's a giant task in California. It's a giant task in Texas. It's a giant task in every state, right? So yeah, it's just how far to extend those if we do.
Yes.
Can we start with 6 months? At most a year, because similar to what happened, going from one version to another before, it was that there will be a period of time in which NEMSIS is not going to receive data. So if it's that NEMSIS is going to close reception of version 3.4.0 data, then the counts aren't going to be as high as they have been. So if you're comfortable with that, then you can say a date, but states need to have a time to implement. And of course, what might happen is success will be seen in many states as they implement and roll it out. And the realization will be, hey, what, we're going to be able to do this sooner than we thought.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. I do want to address Mark's comment in chat because he has a very good point. There are several states that say in statutory language that they have to have the most recent, or most current version. So we may have to put something out that, this is where we have to talk to the state directors to see what would fly, but could we say we have 2 current versions to make that work? I guess, and I don't want to pick on Mark because I really appreciate all your comments. I also don't want to plan I don't want to plan for California and Texas when they're 2 of the the anomalies in terms of, the Rhode Islands and Delawares and smaller states. But I certainly need to make sure that what we do meets your needs as well as everybody else's. So, yeah, I think Karin's a good point. We could start with 6 months. We could start with a little bit later. Um, Let us take this back, put it together in some kind of a little presentation with the findings today, run it by the state directors and see what they say. I think it's fair to say that what I hear is keeping 3.5 where it is and moving forward with that implementation, but delaying 3.4 is the real issue.
All right, sounds great, Eric. Thank you. Any last comments regarding the timelines?
I think these decisions really speak to the ability to become agile with the standard. If we push these things back each time, then it's going to become really difficult to have the NEMSIS standard be something that's smaller and more incremental. I mean, we're excited about 3.5. It's done in our product, and looking forward to implementing it with customers and states. But I mean, as far as Digitech's view, we're for change, and we'd like to see these get closed out, the old versions, and move to the new each time. So I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And Christian basically shared the same thought as well with the justification. So thank you, Christian. Okay, great. Eric, do you want to introduce the future projects piece? Do you want me to provide those slides, show those slides as you talk about that? And we have a poll for folks to take associated with that. Would that be valuable to have me steer? I'm not hearing Eric. I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Technology, man, it's tough. So we talked yesterday afternoon, Clay, Julianne, rest of the TAC members were in. We had kind of just an informal meeting, and we're talking about a whole different thing, a whole different list of projects. And I was telling the TAC about some of the things that were on my mind, some of the things that I've heard, some of the requests that we've had, some of the, different organizations that reach out and request data, and they just ask, for things from time to time. And then I've mentioned a couple of my pet projects on these calls the last couple of days. And we decided it might be a good idea to put together a list of just data considerations, things we're talking about in terms of NEMSIS in the EMS industry moving forward, and just give some big ticket topics and introduce them to you with no more thought in them than a general definition of kind of what's been asked in some cases or what we thought about in others, and ask you, what do you think is important? And this perspective can come from where you sit in the world. So from, we're not even concerned about that for this process. We just like to, as I go through this list, and then we'll put them up and ask you to rank them. Which do you think is important? So with that, Clay, if you go to the first slide, we'll just hit some of the top ones. And I realize I've skewed some of this by telling you my opinion on this in some presentations, but we'll try to keep it pretty straight here for the next couple slides. So these are the industry kind of data considerations we've talked about. One is collecting data specifically to violence against EMS clinicians, and that would be in the line of duty, injuries suffered as a result of violence. So whether a person was spit on, whether they were physically assaulted, verbally assaulted, stabbed, struck, something thrown at them, anything in those categories. Don't think too much about the details of it, just high level. What would this be good for our industry to have data on? Then EMS injuries themselves. These are the back injuries of old, the falls and slips, the fractures and things not related to assault. So how are our personnel getting injured in the field? Line of duty deaths, and I know DOT is working with the National EMS Memorial, and they're talking about kind of formalizing a process, but I'm talking about specifically data related to the actual line of duty death. And think about this in terms of what the fire folks do. They also have the near misses thing that we talked about. And then EMS service demographics. So more specific information on the actual demographics of the agency itself, where station locations, information about the actual stations or staffing. That would be good. Someone just put up EMS suicide. Chris, I don't know if you can do this or not, but could you add that one to our list for our polling questions?
Yes.
And let's just put in parentheses after suicide, let's put mental health. And I apologize who shared that, it just disappeared. Is that okay with you, Matthew? Is that okay if we add mental health just after that? If it's not, just light it up in chats and we'll take it off. Oh, perfect, he said. So yes, Chris, thank you. The next one would be ambulance crashes. Data on the crash, like the geographical location, what mode of response it was in, the nature, was it night during a snowstorm, the locations, the actual damage to the vehicle, where people were in the back of the units, was there a patient involved, so on and so forth. And then general operational data. This would be, think of like a chief's report, the number of calls last night, the type of calls, sentinel events, those types of things. Mobile integrated health. So we talked about this in different meetings, depending on what you participate in. We talked about kind of this modular approach. Do we capture data on mobile integrated health related to delivery of out-of-hospital care, generally not emergent, but the things that we may be doing more as a part of ET3, the hospital checks, the wellness checks, and then community paramedicine, again, out of hospital, generally non-emergent, by healthcare clinicians. Now, some of you may ask the difference between mobile integrated health and community paramedicine. I've heard different discussions and arguments. I will tell you for the purposes of our process here today, to me, mobile integrated health is by clinicians, including non-traditional EMS personnel. So this is where we have a nurse or a nurse practitioner or a physician or someone working in tandem with the EMS personnel in the ambulance. Community paramedicine to me is the paramedics, the EMTs, the EMS personnel who are out in the community without those non-EMS clinicians providing care. Now, I may have that completely wrong, but at least for today's exercise, let's go with those two definitions. Aeromedical services data. I know that's a tough one because of regulatory reasons, but it keeps coming up from time to time. And even in our office, there are committees that in another division, not NHTSA, obviously FAA, looking at data related things to aeromedical services. Critical care specific data elements, and then linked to provider IDs, skills, and patient experience. And this is something that's been discussed when NREMT established that national provider database. The number that they established for the provider is one that could actually be linked to CMS. It could also be used to track the number of times Chris Huffman delivered a baby or had a particular cardiac patient. And NREMT's thought was, if they could look 2 years into Chris's career and say, well, he's delivered 12 babies, so he doesn't have to do that part of his continuing education this year. He's obviously well vested. Or, Eric Cheney transported 300 cardiac patients, so we're going to go ahead and check him off on recognition of cardiac emergencies. Very high level. And then the last one would be inventory tracking. And I'm not talking about what's in your closet or how many boxes of gloves you have in your facility, although it could be. I think in this case, it's more about the PPE usage that was discussed coming out of the COVID response. So what do you have available? What are you burning? What do you need type of things? You know, I just want to preface this with this, there's no funding for any of these at this point. However, when I have a specific list of priorities, then I know who to target for funding for some of these things. The other part of this is we have not discussed specific details about how it would happen, whether the data would be a part of NEMSIS. In fact, for many of these, and I put that up on a slide yesterday, I do not want it to be a part of NEMSIS. Violence specifically would not be a part of the patient care report. It would set aside from it for a number of reasons that we've discussed. And I think somebody just put one up, the legal issues of that report. So anyhow, I know that, and Jonathan just put up a good point. I know that there's some people in industry already doing these. There are great examples of software vendors that are looking at mental and behavioral health things, that are looking at, you know, different exchange data and critical care. So it's not like we would build this in a vacuum. I can assure you of that. I love it when somebody comes to the table with a 75% solution. But for today, kind of set all of that aside and just, my big ask here is, of this list, what's important? What do you think are the high priority ticket items? That's what I'm asking. Did anyone add anything else in the chat that we should add before?
It doesn't look like, Eric.
And I'll just mention one other thing. I don't know if this was said yesterday, and Jonathan put it in here. It's a good point. Pulsed, ONC has picked up Pulsed and Pulsed data as a part of that. And it's their USCDI, correct, Clay? Is where they're focusing on that. So Pulse data is going to be addressed at a national level, whether we like it or not. So that one's coming. So with that, Clay, you have any comments that you'd like to add, please?
No, thank you very much. You'll see some polls that are going to come up from Chris. We'd love to rank over 14 things, but that's incredibly hard to do, right? You can find the top and you can find the bottom, but it's hard to do the middle. So we're going to do this with Likert scale, 1 to 5. And if you would just rank the 14 items as to their importance for Eric to consider. So just go ahead and fill out this poll if you would. It'll take a couple minutes, but it will be incredibly valuable. And clearly could have many that end up as very important, and but even that much information will be incredibly valuable to Eric. So feel free to go ahead and respond.
And Clay, while they're doing that, I'll just reiterate, because I know we're coming to the close of the meeting here. Comments like I just received from Jonathan and others, I love that stuff. You can email me anytime, and I mean that, and you'll get a response. I guarantee it. The more background information I have, the more I know that somebody's doing a great job with this, or this state just has taken on this project and it's turned out really well, and here's how I think we can move that forward. Man, anything like that you have, please let me know about it. We're always interested in how we can make this process better and make this product better.
Thank you, Eric. Great. Okay. Fantastic. It looks like we may have most folks completed so far. Looks like we're slowing down on the frequency with which it's updated. Yeah. So feel free to go ahead and finish that up. I'm gonna save time, if it's okay, Julianne, to ensure that folks can complete an assessment of the overall meeting within the time frame of the meeting. Are you prepared to talk about that, either Julianne or Ben?
That would be Tim. If we could get Tim to just give a plug and the link for the end of meeting evaluation, that would be awesome.
Sure. Sorry, I'm a little scattered trying to get the screenshot of the polls, but thank you everyone for your participation the last few days. We very much appreciate everything that you have shared and your willingness to engage and participate with us. We want to make sure that these meetings continue to be valuable for you. So I'm going to post a link in the chat. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple minutes to just complete the evaluation, it should just be a handful of questions. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Yeah, I'll close this out while you're completing that survey. Thank you. We'll ensure that we're not taking you longer than one, but I do so appreciate the time and the effort that folks put into attending this meeting. We just have pages and pages of notes, and this will be our guide for this next year as to how best to resolve a number of these very hard issues. And we may be talking about a handful of these, hopefully, together in Deer Valley or up at Alta or Snowbird or somewhere fun next summer, if that works out. But we are so appreciative of you helping us to improve the standard. This has always been a joint effort, and that's been another very unique attribute of the NEMSIS system is we decide as stakeholders how best to modify the standard and move it forward. So thank you for that, and thank you for your participation on behalf of the entire NEMSIS Technical Assistance Center. Eric, anything in addition you'd like to share?
No, sir, just be safe, take care of your family, take care of yourselves, take care of your colleagues that are working in the field. I think that a lot of times the focus is on the healthcare clinician in the field, and it should be, but we forget the stressful situations that we're putting the administrative staff in back at headquarters, trying to juggle the balls and meet all the demands that are being put on them. So please take care of yourselves, and I hope we get to see you in person at NESEMSO's meeting, especially the data managers and some of the vendors towards the end of this year.
All right, fantastic. We will, Tim, we probably need to keep the meeting open so folks can see the link. So we'll keep the meeting open until 1 o'clock. I think that's the end of the formal activity. So please, if you'd continue to fill out the polls before you leave the session, that would be much appreciated. Thank you everyone for participating. Very much appreciate it.